Well, it's been almost 3 years since I had today's guest on the show, but Rudy Winston is back for a fresh and detailed look at all of the Canon autofocus options and settings. This is a 2025 update on Canon Autofocus Explained. Hi, welcome to Behind the Shot. I'm Steve Brazel, and today we have a highly requested show for you. It's not a normal Behind the Shot show. I'll explain as we kind of go through, but today is going to be a 2025 update on the last video that I did with today's guest, almost exactly 3 years ago, on Canon Autofocus Explained. And I want to start with this. I've got a couple things to go through before I bring my guests on. If you are not a Canon shooter and you've started watching this, please don't run away. We're using Canon in the examples today, right? Canon Autofocus Explained. But whatever brand you use, Nikon, Sony, Panasonic, whatever it is that you're shooting, most of today's cameras are going to have some kind of an equivalent to the settings that we're going to talk about. Autofocus kind of works, similar across brands. Autofocus names or option names may change between brands. In fact, for that matter, sometimes the autofocus option names change even within a brand, but between models. Some may be more or less granular between brands or between models. And they may be in different places on menus between brands or even, again, between models. But here's the thing. Understanding autofocus concepts, I think, is one of the most important things for photographers. How autofocus works, what options are available for you to tweak that autofocus system to how you shoot, what subject or genre you shoot, regardless of your brand. This is going to help you. Now, before I bring Rudy on, I do need to do some setup, some disclaimers, that type of a thing. If you don't want to hear these, I completely understand. I have timestamp chapter markers in the description on YouTube. If you're watching one of the podcast feeds, audio only or video podcast feeds, because this is a podcast first and foremost, head to behindtheshot.tv and over at the website, find the blog post for this episode. And I've got all the chapter timestamps in there as well so that you can jump to whatever part interests you. For that matter, after you've watched a part, if you want to revisit it, use the timestamps. That'll make it easy. So a couple things to go through first. Back in February of 2022, so again, almost exactly 3 years ago, I did a show with Canon technical advisor, the legendary Rudy Winston. Now, to say that that show was popular, at least for my YouTube channel and podcast, is an understatement. To date on YouTube, it's got about 453,000 views. For me, that's big, okay? That's in addition, by the way, to the two different podcast feeds. But here's the thing. When we recorded that show, the R3 was kind of brand new and it was not widely available and I couldn't get one. So for that show, I used my Canon R5 for the menu examples during the show. We talked about the autofocus settings that were available in the newer R3 at the time, but I didn't have it to show those examples. And almost immediately people started commenting, which I love the comments. Leave your comments. Commenting, I really wish that you had an R3 and would go through the R3 stuff. Well, since that show, we've had an R6 Mark II and we've had an R5 Mark II come out. And again, lots of people have requested that I do an update to cover some of those newer autofocus features, renaming, moving of the features that are available. My thing is, it doesn't make a ton of sense to do one of these autofocus shows, at least for the subject of autofocus, for each and every model of a Canon camera. There's too much overlap. So I wanted to wait until the R1 actually had been released. And in November of 2024, it started hitting store shelves. So today, we're going to do basically the same thing we did 3 years ago. We're going to go through all of the AF menus. We're going to describe every single command, every single option to you in detail. For this show, I'm going to be using the R1 for the menu examples, but here's the thing. When I used the R5 last time, some people complained that I was using a body out of their price range. One comment was something like, oh, another video for rich people. I had others complain that I wasn't using a Canon R3. So I want to just take a second and explain to you that higher end bodies have features that the lower end bodies don't have. I need the higher end body to show those features, but the higher end bodies mostly, if not all, have the features that are in those lower end bodies. So for me to cover the most settings, as many settings and options as possible, spanning bodies of all different price ranges, my best choice is to use the highest end body that I can. In this case, it's an R1. Unfortunately, I don't own a Canon R1, so I do need to take a second to just say a huge thank you to Canon USA for getting me the Canon R1 that's in front of me. Scott Heath, thank you for your help doing this. And please, can I keep it? No. This camera I've been playing with it since they sent it to me. I've only got like 2 weeks with the camera, and wow, it's amazing. One last disclaimer. I had some people comment on the last video that they wished I had inserted some B-roll showing you features that we're talking about through the actual viewfinder so that you could see the AF points moving around as a soccer player ran or a bird was flying by. And I want to let you know, first of all, thank you for the suggestions. I appreciate all of them. But again, with this video, I'm making an intentional choice, right or wrong, to not do that. And here's why. There's a few production reasons for it. But the biggest reason to me is I really want this video to be as generic as I can make it. In a perfect world, this would be a replacement for the manual. I'm actually hoping that you've got your camera in your hands as we're going through the options and settings, right? Then once you better understand what those settings mean, what the concepts are behind them, you can take your camera out and look through the viewfinder and test them to find out what works for your shooting style, for your genre of photography. And finally, again, if you're watching on YouTube, I have lots of chapter timestamps down below in the description. Head down below, hit like and subscribe on your way down. If you're doing the podcast feeds, jump over to behindtheshot.tv. Find the chapter markers that I've got, the timestamps that I've got in the blog post there. And that's everything I need to do to set this thing up. So please welcome back to the show, my friend and an amazing guy, technical marketing consultant for Canon USA, Rudy Winston. Rudy, how are you, buddy?
Steve, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm doing great. Happy New Year to you and your family and to all your viewers and listeners. And I'm delighted to be here. What an opportunity. And I'm really looking forward to it.
I'm so glad to have you back. And last time you were on, we took some time, like I do with all of my guests, to do a little getting to know Rudy. So if you're interested in understanding more about what Rudy photographs and a little more about Rudy, go back to that original show, watch that. We've got a lot of stuff to get through today, so I'm going to jump right into it here in just a second. But again, I'm so glad that you're here, and I appreciate everything that you do for the photography community as a whole. I do want to mention Rudy's in a different time zone than me, a couple different time zones away from me. There is some lag. So to the audience, if we end up stepping on each other at some point, our apologies ahead of time. Hey, technology is what it is. So with that in mind, let's jump over to the Canon R1. And what we're going to do is we're going to start on autofocus menu number 1. And then there are some actual autofocus commands that are not on the autofocus menus, which I find kind of interesting, or at least I should say autofocus tangential commands that are not on these autofocus menus. So let's start with autofocus menu number 1. Again, this is on a Canon R1. We're just going to go ahead and run down the list. And first of all, we've got AF operation defaults to 1 shot. When you hit the button, you have the option of 1 shot or servo. So if you would explain these options to us.
Sure, Steve. And there's actually on most of our cameras a third option, which is not on the R1. And that's an option we call AI focus. I'll explain that in a moment. But this is something that is important to understand. And I love what you said at the beginning, Steve, about welcoming listeners and users of other camera systems to this podcast, because even though the terminologies may be different, you're going to have control settings, certainly with regard to what we call AF operation, that'll be very, very similar. With Canon, 1 shot means, as far as focusing is concerned, that the camera is once you activate focus, it's going to focus on what it sees. And as long as you keep your finger on the AF activation button, it'll lock the focus at that point. It assumes a stationary subject. Servo, and please note, for long-time Canon users, we do not call it AI servo anymore. It's just servo. Servo assumes a moving subject, and that can be moving at virtually any speed. We could be talking about, a race car. We could be talking about a child taking their first steps. Doesn't matter. Servo assumes a moving subject. You put your focusing area on that subject and activate autofocus, and the camera is going to start continuously focusing upon what it sees there. AI focus, which is not shown here because the R1 camera doesn't have it, but almost every camera in our system does other than that. AI focus is a third distinct automatic setting that basically automates the choice of one shot or servo autofocus. The idea is that for quick casual shooting, you don't really have to think about, okay, should I be in servo? Should I be in one shot? And that kind of thing. And interestingly, if it sees a subject that at first is stationary and you focus on it and kind of lock the focus, it'll confirm that. But then if that subject starts moving and the focusing points see that while your finger's on the button, it'll switch into servo.
That makes a ton of sense to me. I guess the question is, why isn't that third one on the R1?
I think the feeling was the R1 is dedicated at such a high level professional audience. I'll probably reference this a couple of times because I just saw it again recently. Your podcast with Jeff Cable, the Olympic sports shooter. The R1 targets photographers like that. And most of the time, this is something that they just want to set themselves and are comfortable with setting it themselves and aren't looking for the camera to automate it. At least that's the thought process of our designers.
Yeah, and that makes sense. And that show actually with Jeff Cable, which was using the R1 at the Olympics, this past Olympics, was interesting because Jeff was using a pre-production R1, and that was key because he made a couple of comments during the show about some features that, he couldn't customize the way that he wanted. And a lot of the comments are, I don't understand. All I did was this, this, and this. And what they don't understand was the pre-production firmware didn't have those options for him. So this type of a camera is literally geared for that type of sports action, but make no mistake, obviously, anybody can use a camera like this. So the second one is AF area. And right now it's set to 1, but again, when you hit the OK button in the middle, it gives you these different options. Let's run through these because you and I kind of talked in the green room about this. The first 4 are duplicated with and without locks. So let's go left to right. When we get to the second row, let's kind of touch on why 4 of them are there twice.
Sure. First off, if you are using pretty much any of our mirrorless cameras in the last few years, and I don't just mean like an R3 or something, I mean going back actually to like an EOS R or RP, you're going to see the first row of these, the top row of these in your camera. So we'll go through these. You're going to have, if you're a Canon user, you're going to have essentially the same options. There might be a couple of differences, but we'll talk about that. Spot AF is giving you a single focusing point, and it's smaller in terms of its size and the area of the picture that it's sampling than any of the other areas. The beauty of Spot AF is you got that one point, and you can be very precise about what part of a subject you are trying to put in sharpest focus. There is a misconception among some people that the Spot AF is going to be more accurate than any of the others. That's not true. It just simply samples a smaller area. And if you are being careful, especially with a non-moving subject, you can much more precisely tell the camera, hey, I want you to focus right on this little part of the flower in this macro shot, or whatever the case might be.
Okay, so I need to follow up on that with the second point, because there is something I've been aware of since I moved to my R5. The second one is 1-point AF, which before you describe it, back on my 5D Mark IV, I had these 2 options. But the square representation on the screen for 1-point versus the spot point, the 1-point seems way bigger now. Is that representative of it's actually sampling a larger area now than it did like on the 5D Mark IV?
Yeah, it basically is. And keep in mind that now with the mirrorless cameras, you're assessing focusing right off the imaging sensor. With digital SLRs like a 5D, any of the 5D series, or any of the digital SLRs, when you were shooting through the viewfinder, you were focusing with a separate, dedicated focusing sensor. Your imaging sensor had nothing to do with assessing and dealing with autofocus. So here, the concepts are the same, but you are dealing with a little larger square area that is being sampled off the imaging sensor. And interestingly, if you compare a full frame camera, like any of the cameras we've been talking about, or an EOS R8, for instance, if you compare the 1.AF size in the viewfinder to what you get with one of our APS-C cameras, like an EOS R7 or an R10 or something like that, you'll see on the smaller sensor cameras, that point looks even bigger because it's using basically the same area, but since there's less sensor to deal with, it appears a little larger.
Okay. That just answered a ton of my questions. Because when I came from that 5D Mark IV to the R5, it threw me that I want this, why is the box so much bigger? Maybe I should go to the Spot AF. Now I understand it's literally an engineering difference. So let's talk about 1.AF.
Yeah, 1 is basically, again, you are restricting what the camera is sampling to autofocus to just that one focusing point, with the few exceptions that we'll talk about. And it again, is giving you good control. The fact that it's sampling a larger area, though, than the Spot AF does give you an advantage in a couple of cases. If you've got subjects that don't have a lot of texture and detail, it's getting more area to kind of get some information from. Likewise, if your subject is moving, you can think of sports and wildlife. Spot AF is really tough because that little spot needs to see detail continuously if it's a moving subject. And that can be hard, even for skilled photographers, when you're using such a small spot. So single point is actually beneficial in those situations. And lastly, there isn't a difference technically in terms of its low light levels, the minimum threshold that it can read autofocus. But again, because you're sampling a bigger area, you're giving the system a little more chance to be able to grab onto something when you are shooting those candlelight pictures or whatever that case may be.
So you have the ability to have more information I'm going to say in the scene, but I mean in that focus point. Right. So that it can find the contrast or whatever it is that it needs to be able to actually adjust it and focus. But that leads us, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but these next two can be discussed together in a way, because you have expanded AF and then expanded AF area around. So run through those two, because I will say for concert photography, I like the second one myself. I use the expanded AF area around for what I shoot. So explain these two to me. Because I think a lot of people misunderstand these as being 5 focus points or 9 focus points, which is not my understanding.
Yeah, it's easy to misunderstand on these. And at the end, I'll clarify something that I said 3 years ago in our first discussion in answering a question you had about this. But don't let me jump ahead. Either of these, the concept is the same. The idea is, if the system can't find enough detail, texture, and so on with the central principal primary focusing point that the little points are surrounding, if it can't see enough information in the central point, it will immediately begin to ask the peripheral points, hey, do you see detail? Do you see detail? Giving you more of a chance that athlete running straight at the camera, that bird that's flying, into your picture area, whatever, that you'll be able to see something and the system can latch onto it. The concept is the same on both of them. Now, when we spoke a few years ago, Steve, you asked an astute question, and frankly, I didn't give you the clearest answer, and that's my bad. That's on me. When we first initiated this back in the digital SLR days, the one we had was the one you have highlighted now, what you can think of 4-point surround expansion, and there was no 8-point around. We did get at the time some feedback from customers who said, look, I'd love it if you could just, add boxes so that I've got, like a fully surrounded primary point and not just like, north, south, east, and west. And so our engineers in some future digital SLRs added the 8-point surrounding expansion, which you'll get to in a second. So that's the reason for the two of them. They just never got rid of the first one. It's still there as a legacy type of thing. The concept is the same, though.
I apologize. I have to interrupt on that because I need to follow up on that. Based on what you just said, that the first one is more legacy, and this came from, requests, right? From
exactly
users. Are you saying that you would almost never recommend using this one and you'd recommend using that one if you're going to use one of the expands?
Not at all. Not at all. Personal taste. Just understand in either case, your primary, it's not like you're working with just a bigger cluster of focusing points that will always be active when you're shooting something. It starts with whatever point is in the center of that cluster. And then if that point runs into roadblocks, it'll immediately start looking at the surrounding points to see, okay, do we have enough information here to make a good judgment?
Okay,
so
that makes more sense.
With either one.
Okay, that makes way more sense to me. So with the 4 versus the 8 around, this may be an impossible question, and I apologize if it is. Can you think of a scenario where the 4 surround would be a better choice than the 8 surround? Like, I use the 8 surround because I shoot in very low light with very tough lighting with concerts. And my thought process is, if it can't find it on that center point, I want to give it as many options to go whatever direction I want or whatever direction it needs as an assist to that center point. Am I right?
The only thing that comes to mind immediately, and I'm not speaking to you when I say this, is that there may be some photographers who understand the concept of how the AF point expansion works in Canon and who say, okay, cool. I love having, a backup in my back pocket for emergencies, so to speak, where the system can kind of look elsewhere if it has to. But I really don't want it to do that often. And I really want to mostly be sure of exactly what I'm trying to focus on. And I can see for those folks, there may be some folks who say, look, the less chances there are of it going, over to, diagonally a little bit, the better. I'm kind of just guessing here at why a photographer might. There is no other reason that I can think of why you would prefer one over the other. A lot of it just comes down to personal taste. And I certainly understand, Steve, why you prefer the 8 surrounding points. And, many of our customers do. It's, again, why they added it back, years ago.
Okay. Yeah. And when I'm in servo mode tracking type thing, I absolutely love that particular focus zone. So let's get into the flexible zones. Flexible zone AF1, AF2, and AF3. And we'll go into whole area first. So let's do the 1, 2, 3 first. So explain flexible.
Okay. It helps to just understand where we came from here, because if you have an original EOS R6 or R5 or the original EOS R for that matter, you had a zone 1, zone 2, zone 3, but they weren't flexible. You basically had a relatively small square zone, bigger than the single focusing points and all that. It's a cluster of points. And then you had a kind of elongated vertical one and an elongated horizontal one on the older cameras.
Yep.
When we went to the flexible zone system, it starts out essentially the same way. And, going from 1, 2 to 3. But now you can push a button, and then with the dials, you can actually change the shape and aspect ratio, if you will, of your zones. You can make them long and skinny. You can make them short and broad, or, a little square, or whatever you want. It's actually a very interesting way of working when you want broader coverage than just a single focusing point, either the 1-point AF or the spot AF would give you. And it's You can use it with things like face detection and all too, which is kind of neat. One thing to keep in mind with any of the zones, and this includes going back to the earlier cameras where you could not change the size. You could move the zone up or down, left or right, and so on, but you couldn't change the size of it. But in any of these cases, with Zone AF, you're dealing with multiple focusing points that are now always active within that zone. The camera is going to look at whatever you point that zone at, and it's going to, unless you have face detection active, it's going to try to focus on the nearest subject, the nearest thing it sees with detail in that zone. So it's not going to, there are people who have a misconception that, oh, if I use Zone AF and I got this big, broad expansion of focusing points, it'll just put everything in the zone in focus, right? No. It's going to focus on whatever detail it sees that it believes is the nearest thing to the camera. That's where it's going to put the sharpest plane of focus. And then it's going to let focus kind of drift as you go in front of that and beyond that.
So now you're talking normal depth of field. In other words, using a zone doesn't bypass the fact that you still have a depth of field to deal with.
Exactly.
You know, so if they're on different focal planes, the fact that everything in that particular zone is seen by the zone, obviously it's not going to focus on the tree in the background and the person in the front if you're at 2.8.
You got it. You got it. Exactly. And people need to understand that. It's still going to focus on whatever it sees is nearest.
That makes sense, because that makes me think of some of the questions that people sent me, and that relates to how they asked the question, which immediately I saw this question. You'll understand when I get to the question. I saw the question and thought, well, I'm just going to answer that and tell them. But no, you're talking depth of field, which is different from focus. But the reality is, yeah, the zone things could confuse those two things to people, which then brings us to the big zone, which is whole area AF. Is that basically just a big 1, 2, 3?
Not exactly. Whole area AF starts to relate to subject tracking. And we'll get to that a little more in a moment. But the idea is you've opened up, basically with most lenses, the whole picture area. So the system is able to now find focus, whether your subject is in the center, off in one of the corners, or, at the bottom, whatever the case might be. And it's also opened the ability for the system to track and follow a subject around the frame over the whole picture area. You are not confining it to just the area of one of those flexible zones that I just spoke of a moment ago. And it's clearly, it's one of the most really amazing things that we see in photography today, not just with Canon, but certainly with modern mirrorless cameras from pretty much every manufacturer, is, the ability for these systems to not just put a focusing point on a subject and focus on it, but to be able to follow it around the viewfinder. Let's be very clear. And I know we made this point of emphasis when we spoke a few years ago, Steve, but it bears repeating to all of your listeners. When in the old digital SLR days, when we, could only pick a single focusing point or whatever, and we could, move it up and down or left or right a little bit, but, we still, when we were shooting that football game or whatever, we put that focusing point on a subject, and then we followed it around the scene as it, ran towards us or whatever. It was up to us to move the camera and the lens to keep that focusing point on the subject. We used to call continuous autofocus or servo autofocus in those situations focus tracking. Back in those days, if you go back and start looking in, old magazine articles from, the 1990s and so on, you'll see them refer to focus tracking, talking about what we call now servo autofocus, just continuous focusing on moving subjects. In the mirrorless era, that is not what we call focus tracking anymore. Please understand that if you're listening and this isn't clear to you. Nowadays, when we say focus tracking, and this isn't just Canon, this is all the manufacturers. Pick your name. Any of them are talking the same thing. Now we're talking about the ability to find a subject first. And then if that subject It could be a bird in flight. It could be anything else. If that subject starts to move around the frame, autofocus points change their location and follow it. That is now what we call focus tracking. We're assuming servo autofocus, continuously updating the focus with a moving subject. But it's also that ability for the subject to move around the frame and for focusing points to stay with it. That is focus tracking in the modern world.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So now we're going to get to the padlocks, because my R5 doesn't have those. Right. And when they sent me, again, I've only got 2 weeks with this R1, and they sent me the R1, and I pulled out the manual because, yes, got to do it right. I had to pull out the manual, by the way, to figure out how to adjust the diopter on this camera, because the diopter wouldn't turn. And I Googled it, and people were saying, oh, the screw's too tight. I'm like, no, the screw's not too tight. You have to pull out on the diopter. So always read your manual. And I've read the manual on these, but I'm not sure I'm still clear why those first 4, Spot AF, single point, and the 2 expansion options, why they're duplicated with a padlock. So I'm guessing the answer is going to be the same for all 4 of them. Maybe not. It's just the same points. But what does the padlock mean?
Yeah, I'm glad you're asking the question, and that we have a moment to explain it. I'm going to give you the simple short answer, and then a little bit of the background so you understand.
Okay.
The simple short answer is, if you pick any of the focus areas, the AF areas that have the little padlock icon, you are telling the system, hey, no matter what, don't deviate from this focusing area. Don't try to track a subject. Don't try to look for a person or a person's eye or an animal eye that isn't right where the focusing area is, and sort of move where we're focusing. The padlock settings are ideal for photographers who either A, want to work with their camera the way we did a few years back, the digital SLR era or whatever, where we used a single focusing point and that was it. You know, an example might be somebody shooting macro pictures of a flower, raindrops on a flower, for instance. You might be, walking around and you see, these, a flower petal with, these kind of cool drops of water. And you're thinking, oh, what a great macro shot that would be. You pull out your macro lens and you say, I want my sharpest focus right here. Now, I don't want the camera trying to, shift it for me. I don't want the camera trying to decide what's a little closer or anything. I want it right here. Here, you're telling the system, use whatever focusing area we're working with, and that's it. Don't go outside the area. No ifs, ands, or buts. Now, it's real helpful to understand the evolution in the Canon system, how autofocus has changed since the advent of the EOS R6 and R5. I'm talking the original versions in the year 2020 when those cameras were launched. When those cameras were launched, they introduced the first Canon cameras that could really do focus tracking. And it happened when you went into the full area that they called face detect plus tracking in those days, where the whole area was live. It's what we call whole area AF now. Otherwise, you were working with just, spot AF, single point, cluster of points, whatever. And that was it. When we introduced the R3 and then subsequent EOS models that have been launched since then, with the exception of the latest R5 Mark II and R1, let's forget them for a second.
Okay.
But if you own one of our APS-C cameras, like an EOS R50 or an R10 or something, if you own an EOS R8 full frame camera, if you own an R3, the R3 introduced a system where it started to actually do limited tracking and subject identification, even if you were using just a single focusing point. You could put a single focusing point on a subject, and if it saw that there was like a human face nearby or something, you'd see your focusing point, but you'd also see a little gray box would appear around the subject, and the system is telling you, hey, we identify something else in the scene that, you very well may want in focus. And as you started to move the camera, the focusing point, just move the camera a little closer to that, there was a point where all of a sudden your live AF point would jump to that. It was a limited form of focus tracking. That even if you didn't have your actual live tracking turned on with, full area and all that, the system would actually try to give you an assist. And if you think about it, it actually could be kind of helpful. If you were shooting portraits, for instance, with a subject that was moving, not just a posed subject, not moving at all. There were times that, you might try to be focusing on, a subject's eye or whatever. They'd move a little bit and, all of a sudden your point wasn't on the eye anymore. And you may have missed a key moment. This system would, once it said, okay, I see an eye there, I'm going for it. If you move the camera up to a certain point, it would stay on the eye. So there are times that concept could actually be very helpful to photographers. But there are also times, again, go back to the example of that macro photographer, where it's like, no, I don't want you shifting what I'm focusing on, even if it's just a little bit. I want my focus here. So again, the padlock settings in one, without having to go into the menu and turn off focus tracking. I'm sorry, I'm losing my earpiece here. The padlock settings just basically, you'll notice it up. If you look up top, right now you've got the spot AF with the padlock. If you look up here in the gray area, you can see the little icon with the little kind of racing stripes there and off. It's saying, hey, focus tracking is off. So that's what the lock means. You are cutting out focus tracking and you're using just whatever the AF area is going to give you. Now, again, this is only on the R5 Mark II and on the R1. You're saying to yourself, okay, well, I use an EOS R8. I use an EOS R7. What about me? I don't have the little padlocks. In that case, if you didn't want the system to drift, you just need to make sure that you go into the menu and just turn focus tracking off. And there are ways you can automate that with a button.
This answers so much, because when I first pulled up the R1, I didn't understand what that icon was, the little white dot with the lines, and it said off. So this makes so much more sense to me. And the new feature where if it gets, close, you'll see a gray box. And as you get closer, it may jump to the eye. That's perfect for me doing a singer at a mic stand who's moving a little bit, not moving a lot. I may not have tracking on, or I may not have eye detection on. So I'm using my expansion points and they're moving enough that I'm having to move the camera to try and keep my expanded points near their eye. Well, now it will jump to it. I mean, that to me could be, I need that. All right. So next command is whole area tracking Servo AF, which is that icon again. And when you go in, you have the choice of on or off for that particular whole area tracking Servo AF. Obviously related, explain.
Yeah, this, again, there's a little bit of evolutionary difference as we go from like first generation R6, R5 to mid-level, if you will, not mid-level, but chronologically the middle, where we talk about the R3 and the APS-C cameras like the R6, rather the R7 and the R10 and so on. Anyway, turning whole area tracking on, even if I'm using a single focusing point. Turning it on means my focusing point is basically where the system is going to try to start. And then from there, I've basically opened up the whole picture area for the system to say, okay, now I'm going to follow Steve in your example. I'm going to follow your lead singer, even if he starts jumping around the stage and, his buddies pick him up and, start carrying him around and he's, 4 feet off the ground now compared to where he would have been, whatever it might be.
I want to be at your concert.
You don't want to hear me sing, believe me.
Okay.
Turning on whole area tracking opens it. Whole area is the key word. It opens up the ability for the system to track the whole area, whether you're starting with the whole area open or whether you start with a single point, and then from there you can move the subject, or you even by moving the camera can move all around. Again, there are times where it's not what you want. And in that case, this is one of the things you need to turn off.
Okay. That's handy. Now, this next command, in fact, I can think of a million ways that I'd assign that to a button and use that in a million different ways. But this next one, you and I talked about in the green room, I can't show this command. Focus mode, it's dim, and it's because it has limitations when you can deal with the focus mode in camera. So explain this one and when people may or may not see it.
Yeah. With some of the Canon RF and RFS lenses, principally the lighter weight lenses that are, less expensive, and also in some cases very compact, you will find on some of them that you don't have a focus mode switch on the lens, an AF, MF switch on the lens itself to physically switch from autofocus to manual, like you do on our mid-range and high-end lenses. So in those cases, the camera knows when you put one of those lenses on the camera that, hey, this is a lens without a focus mode switch. Now this takes over and becomes live.
Okay.
Assuming that you're using one of the lenses that has its own focus mode switch, this is intentionally grayed out, so you're not dealing with it in two locations.
And I have an RF 24 to 70 on here right now, which does have its own focus mode switch, so there's no reason to actually have it on. So page number 2 of autofocus, subject detection, starting with the first one, subject to detect. Explain this one and the options available.
Sure. People, sounds pretty self-explanatory. You're telling the system, hey, if we see what we detect as a person, that we want to definitely try to put focusing points on this subject. If there are multiple people in the scene, think real quickly of like a group photo or whatever. Right. It'll try to pick one, but if you say, "Wait a minute, that's not the bride. I want my primary sharpest focus on this person, even if they're not right in the center." Usually, if you just use your little either 4-way or 8-way controller, you
the
can
joystick type thing.
Exactly, that's the word I should have used.
Yeah, okay.
You can move it from the next detected person to the next detected person, and so on. It basically will deal with people as long as it sees enough information to identify the subject as a person. If you think of people down in New Orleans Mardi Gras or something, wearing all kinds of funky masks and stuff, sometimes it may get kind of thrown off by that. In the example, again, I told you I was going to refer to it multiple times. In the example of Jeff Cable, the Olympic photographer, who you did a very nice podcast with recently, he was talking about some of the difficulty photographing swimmers, and how they're wearing, think about it. Now they're wearing, bathing caps. Sometimes they're wearing goggles. That can throw the system off, especially if it doesn't have much time to kind of look at it and ascertain, okay, this is a human face. So just understand that there are going to be times where the people detection can get thrown off. One other thing real quickly, we haven't gotten to eye detection yet, which is a separate setting to turn on and off. We'll get to that in a minute. But assuming you're photographing people and assuming, I'll jump ahead, that you have the eye detection active, the priority that the system works on is it looks first for an eye, then for a face, then for a head. And the idea of the head detection, there's no setting here for it. I'm just telling you the thought process that's in the background.
Right.
The idea of the head detection is even if a person turns their head so that a face isn't visible, the system is usually smart enough to identify, okay, this is still a person. Let's put a box around that head, even if it's turned away from us, so that the camera's not just, jumping focus to the background or, whatever. Then body detection. That is, the idea of a torso, arms, legs, etc. It's right. I want to be clear. We're not saying that it's just going to automatically put the entire body in sharp focus, depending on the lens you're using and the angle you're shooting at and all that. But it's looking for what should I be trying to focus upon? And that's its last recourse. One final thing. With the R5 Mark II and the R1, they have added one additional element to that little sequence, and that is upper body detection. So not just full body, but upper body. So that falls into that little sequence of eyes, face, head, upper body, and body on the latest cameras. Again, a camera like an R3, an EOS R7, any of those cameras that, have come along recently, but they aren't the newest. They don't have that upper body element.
So Jeff Cable's issue partially was the fact also that it was water polo and they have ear cups. So now you can't make out an ear and the face is partially obstructed. But you made the comment, you jumped ahead to eye detection. Let's take a hypothetical. You don't have eye detection on, but you do have people detection on. So what's it doing? Just starting with the face?
Exactly.
Okay.
Face,
and then
head, then body.
Gotcha. And then if you have eye detection on, I just want to throw it out now since we went there, just like you mentioned that you can, if it detects the wrong person in a group photo, you can use the joystick to go left, right, and choose different people. If you have eye detection on, it's the same system. You can change eyes using the joystick still, correct?
Right. And there's another element to that we'll talk about when we get to eye detection that some of the newer cameras have.
Okay. So animals.
Animals means, has always meant since the original R5 and the R6, cats, dogs, and birds. Now, obviously, within that, there's, a broad range of animals that look similar, at least to my untutored eye. I'm not a biologist or anything.
Right.
But, you have animals like wolves, for instance, and so on that you could say, okay, that looks kind of like a dog. But the idea is cats, dogs, and birds. There are going to be unusual looking animals that really don't look like dogs or cats that you can try it with and see if it'll put that single box around that giraffe, that hippopotamus, whatever. And if it does, brilliant, go for it. But understand that if you have animal detection on and something that is definitely not the same look as a dog, a cat, or a bird, it may just say, wait a minute, we'll put a bunch of little focusing points here because we think this is your primary subject, but we don't identify this as a bird, a cat, or a dog. In that case, you'd have a single blue box around it. Now, let me, just before we jump away, the recent cameras have added horses and with that zebras to the list of animals that the system is able to detect. The original R5 and R6. And again, some of the APS-C cameras, like an R50 and R10, cannot detect horses, but they will be able to do the dogs, cats, and birds.
Okay. Horses and zebras. I love that. So what about vehicles?
Okay. Vehicles is another one that people can get a little thrown off with. I mean, obviously we know what a vehicle is. But with vehicles, this system is looking for vehicles that are in a motorsports environment. That is the key. If you think of the look of whether it's stock car racing, open wheeled car racing, motorcycle road racing, dirt bikes too. But if you think of the look of motorcycles and cars in a competition environment, that's what it's programmed to identify. And again, put a single box around. Now, it can certainly work in some cases with more ordinary everyday cars. That could be the family SUV. It could be your buddy's pickup truck. It could be your buddy's, Harley Cruiser coming down the road or whatever. There are times that it'll identify those as a vehicle too, but sometimes it won't. And if it doesn't, just ask yourself, does this look like a, if you will, prototype? It's not the right word, but does this look like a typical vehicle in a motorsports kind of environment? And if the answer is no, my buddy's new Tesla, truck doesn't really look like a typical vehicle in a motorsports environment, that may be why it's not putting the single box around. And instead you got a bunch of little boxes telling you, okay, we identify a subject. We see something to focus on. We haven't identified it as a typical subject to detect.
Okay. But now this one has an extra option. Info for spot detection.
Yeah.
And if
I'm
I
glad
hit
you went
info,
to that.
you'll notice at the bottom, it is actually checking and unchecking spot detection on this one. Explain that.
Yeah, spot detection is so cool. Again, you have this on really everything since like the R6 and the R5, or almost everything. Some of those less expensive cameras may not. I can't remember. But with vehicles, if you have either an open cockpit, in other words, there is not a roof over the driver, or a motorcycle with an exposed operator or rider with a helmet, with spot detection, you are telling the system, hey, detect where that head is with a helmet and put sharpest focus on that point and not on the front of the vehicle. And it's, I don't mean to get personal here, but I've been a motorcycle enthusiast most of my life. If you look at, some of the images that like companies like Ducati have to show some of their high performance bikes, and you see some of the really tight telephoto shots of these guys on bikes going around racetracks and stuff. There's some beautiful stuff. And in a lot of cases, I'm not telling you they used a Canon. I don't know what camera they used, but in a lot of these cases, they put sharpest focus right on the headgear. And it just rivets your eyes to the subject, even if you can't see their face because they're wearing a tinted visor or whatever.
Right.
So that's what spot detection is about. Once again, it only works with an uncovered rider. If you take a typical stock car race, a NASCAR type race, for instance, with cars with roofs on them and stuff, spot detection is usually not going to work to put focus on the driver behind a windshield and under a roof.
Okay, that makes sense. And then none is, I'm guessing, self-explanatory. It means don't detect any of these. Does that need any more explanation that I'm missing?
You absolutely, assessed it correctly. And the only thing I would say is that this can be an important one. There are times, once again, that you want to restrict what the camera is doing in terms of deviating from what you're focusing on with those focusing points. And if you've got people detection or any kind of detection set up, it sometimes will start doing things that you didn't expect, even if you're not shooting a vehicle, an animal, or a person. So there are times if it seems like it's just sort of indecisive and it's like, wait a minute, it's moving slightly on me, make sure your tracking is off and your subjects to detect is off. You've turned those two things off and you've turned the clock back to like 1990 when we were working with one focusing point at a time, and that was it. There are some, even given the tremendous technology we have on today's mirrorless cameras, there are times when that is the right way for a thinking photographer to work.
Okay, that makes sense. Eye detection we touched on. Let's go a little deeper because you have more settings than just auto. You've got disable, auto, right eye, left eye. What are these?
Exactly. Now, again, with some of the previous Canon cameras, once again, I'll reference like the original R6 and R5. You basically had two choices, on or off, or enable or off. And that was it. Auto means, okay, which eye are we going to focus on? The system normally, let's just think of taking humans for a moment. The system is normally going to try to focus on the eye nearest to the camera. So if, Steve, if you were taking a portrait of me and I've got my, I'm sort of turned like this or whatever, it's normally going to try to put focus on the eye closest to the camera, usually. There are times that it gets a little squirrely and doesn't, but usually that's what it's going to do. Auto gives the system the flexibility to pick whatever it thinks is the right one. Again, if it goofed, you can usually use that little 8-way joystick, or on some cameras, it's a 4-way kind of touchpad to just kind of nudge it over to the left or right and kind of get it over to the next one.
Okay.
So that's fine. Left eye and right eye let you tell the system, hey, assuming it sees two eyes, okay, which one? And the thing to keep in mind here, very important, it's talking subjects, left eye or right eye, not the left eye or right eye we see looking through the viewfinder. So it's
okay. So not camera left, camera right. It's subject left, right.
Exactly. Okay. That just make sure you keep that in mind.
All right. That all makes sense.
Auto normally works in my experience, unless you have a distinct reason for setting left or right. Auto 9 times out of 10, auto works fine.
Okay.
In my experience.
I could see, look, if you're using auto and for some person, let's say their one eye is had surgery or is weird for some reason from a camera detection point of view, and it's, closest to the camera. So it's picking the eye that maybe it sees as more open, more definable as an eye. You might be able to use left or right eye to force it where you want it. But that this next one, which is register people priority, this one takes all of this to the next level.
Yeah, this is some pretty cool technology, at least in some situations. I can see where people doing press events, where that there are going to be a couple of principal primary speakers or, whatever at this event. Maybe you're covering you're a press photographer and you're covering an event where, the mayor and the governor are going to be not just speaking at the podium, but, they may be mingling in crowds and stuff like that. And, you need to make sure that more often than not, you're focusing on them.
Right.
A wedding photographer, the bride and the groom, maybe even like the mother of the bride. You may want to know that the system can put priority on focusing on this person, and so on. Let me explain how it works. The system gives you the ability to take just a snapshot, just a headshot. They don't have to be looking straight into the camera, but to just take a headshot of up to 10 different people that might be at this event or even at future events or whatever. It doesn't matter. And then you can actually set a priority for them. You can say, okay, this is the 4th person I took the test shot of, but this is really the main person I want to photograph. This is person number 1. I took that picture of the governor down here as the 7th picture, the 7th person that I photographed in a little test shot. But, he or she is actually the 2nd person. So you can assess a priority to them if you want. Now, that being done, you can go out to photograph that event. The subject recognition system in these cameras is advanced enough that using the face detection, it goes way beyond just assessing, okay, do we have a human face? It's able to recognize faces and say, okay, that's that mother of the bride that you told me about. That's the bride. You put that as the first priority person. So when I take that shot of a bunch of people, on the dance floor or whatever, hey, you recognize the bride's face in the actual scene, go for it because you've got it in your memory. So photograph people and register is allowing you to do that by just taking a quick snapshot of each person you want to register. It just has to be one. You don't have to have multiples. The person, all it requires is that the person's 2 eyes, nose, and mouth are visible. So they don't even have to be posed and looking into the camera. It won't really work with a profile shot. You got to be it's got to see a whole face, but that face doesn't have to be square into the camera, which is kind of cool. Register. I don't mean to jump ahead of you, Steve, but register people from image on card. Hey,
dude, you go anywhere you want, my friend. This is all you.
I'm not going to I hopefully won't take you too far out of kilter here, but register people from image on card means, hey, if I didn't get a shot of a person, but hey, I have a picture of the governor from a press conference I shot 3 months ago. If you just copy that picture onto a memory card, have the card in the camera, and you say, okay, register people from image on card. You can just, okay, which card? And then, okay, find the picture. And you say, okay, yeah, here's the governor speaking at the podium. Bingo. Register that. And that can join your, photograph people and register, although you photographed them earlier.
Yeah, that makes, and I know David Bergman has used this because this is really handy when he's photographing Luke Combs. I can imagine Luke Combs goes into the audience and you want to take a shot of that, but you want to make sure Luke's the one in focus. And you don't want it of all the other faces in that crowd. You want it to prioritize Luke's the guy I need you to grab focus on. And then as you mentioned,
exactly,
this one, change, delete. I'm looking to the left, folks, if you're wondering, because the camera's down here. And when you do HDMI out on the R1, the LCD screen goes dark. And so I'm looking at the menus up on my screen. Change, delete, priority of registered people you talked about. You could take the governor and move them up. You can delete all registered people. And then this one's interesting. So if you're always shooting the same band, or you're always, you're the White House photographer, you can save that data. Anything I missed here?
No, not really. The only thing I would say on the save and load registered data on the card is that that could be helpful if you were working with two cameras. If you have two R5 Mark IIs, which have this feature, and you went to the bother of, okay, before the wedding, I shot, the bride, I shot the groom, I shot the mother of the bride, as people to register. You don't have to do it with a second camera. You can do it with the first camera, take the card out, put it in the second one, and then say, load registered data on card.
Okay. That begs a question. The first camera has their pictures, whether I took them at this event or I loaded them from 3 months ago. It has those pictures on the card. If I move the saved registered data from camera A's card to camera B's card, and I load that data, but the images aren't on that card, is it going to work, or do I have to make sure the images that I registered are on that other card?
No, I hope I spoke clearly. Let's say you have camera A and camera B. Let's just say, example, some photographer is fortunate enough to own two R5 Mark IIs. It could be an R5 Mark II and an R1, but let's just say two R5 Mark IIs. You basically, before an event, you take a few, it could be candid shots, or, hey, sir, can you hold still for a second? Let me just get a quick picture. Fine. Now you get that shot to be able to register and memorize that face. But the point is, you don't have to do it with a second camera. Once you've done whatever pictures you want to use for registration on camera A, you can now take that card out of the camera, put it into camera B, and you can say, okay, I'm at the same event. They're the same people. I want to register. I just go into that setting, load registered people from card. I forget the exact wording, but it's something like that. You just had it on the screen. And bingo, it takes that information and puts it in. Yeah, it's a low registered data on card, and bingo, now you got it in camera B. And you could keep repeating that for as many compatible cameras as you have. Again,
here's the problem, though. I'm sorry, go ahead, finish.
No, I was just going to repeat that, as of right now, this is only a feature on the EOS R1 and R5 Mark II. It'll be cool if we see it on future, more affordable cameras. But, up to now, it's been introduced on these two in the year 2024.
And here's kind of where my question went. Okay, so you take the card out of camera A. It has the photos and the saved registered data. You put it in camera B. You load the saved registered data. It can reference the photos on that card if it needs to. And I guess that's my question is, let's push it to the extreme. Well, let's do that first. You register it in camera B. You then take that card out, put it back in the other camera. Now, camera B no longer has access to the reference pictures. So going to the extreme, camera A, let's say I don't take the card out. Let's say I put two cards in a computer and I transfer just the saved registered data file and put it in camera B. So camera B never gets to see the reference photos. Are those reference photos required when you load the data? Do you know?
It's basically, again, if I'm reading your question correctly, all it needs is the initial shot information to begin with. And then if you put in any kind of priority for it or whatever, and you've told it load registered data, that's the data. It takes all that, including the facial data and stuff, and brings it into its memory bank. You can now take that card out of camera B, put it back in camera A, and use it to shoot the event. Camera B can have its own cards, but the data is now in camera B, and it can, rely on it anytime it needs to.
Okay, that makes sense. So effectively, everything it needs is in the saved data. And then action priority is another new one. It only has two options, and that is disable, and then sporting events has another submenu for which sporting event. So let's start with what's action priority and what can I set?
Well, first off, if you go back to highlight the top there, action where it says action priority. Oops, I'm sorry. One more in. There you go. If you hit your set button, you got disable and enable. So obviously you can turn it on or off. Okay. Kind of self-explanatory. Action priority is one of the technologies that our engineers were most proud of as we launched the R5 Mark II and the R1. because basically what they devised is a system that is intelligent enough and can process data fast enough and accurately enough that if you tell it a specific sport out of those three, okay, and I'll get to that in a minute, it can identify specific motions and movements that are characteristic of that sport.
Wow.
So soccer is a perfect example. It can recognize throw-ins. It can recognize a goalie diving to make a save. It can recognize, somebody, getting ready to kick the ball, whether it's a corner kick or just somebody reacting in midfield or whatever. It's especially, and then what it does is it'll put a focusing point or your focusing area on that person. It's especially useful in compositions where you have more than one athlete in the scene. If you think back to the glory days of Sports Illustrated magazine, I know that influenced me many, many times back in the 80s, the 90s, into the early 2000s. I know magazines aren't the thing they used to be, but the photography there, those beautifully tight vertical cover shots that they would have week after week in Sports Illustrated, just tack sharp stuff that used to amaze me as a younger photographer. In situations like that, where your composition is a tight shot of one person, this isn't really something you need. You're not going to break the camera by having it on, but this isn't what it's for. This is for when you're, shooting with that 70 to 200 zoom, which isn't getting you crazy tight on subjects that are, 40, 50 feet or more out into the field from the sidelines where you are. You can now tell us, you're not telling the system itself is able to identify specific movements and say, hey, this is a soccer player about to head the ball, and it'll just move the focusing point to them. Even if they're not in the center. I mean, it'll just jump. Honestly, until we had a press event for the working photo press, and then at the same time, a couple days later, at the same event, we had photographers like Jeff Cable, who we knew were going to be coming in for the Olympics, do the same kinds of things. We set up trials with basketball and soccer and stuff. And honestly, we weren't sure what the photographers were going to think. Most of them came away just blown away. They said, this technology is just off the hook. It just, I'm getting sharp stuff here that I could not have gotten with, subjects that are, partially obscuring my basketball player who's about ready to drive to the hoop or whatever. They said it's just uncanny how the system knows to move focusing points to a subject that's about to do a specific activity. Again, shooting, passing, whatever. It's a little different for the three different sports. And the ball is a primary element in the system identifying what a subject is about to do. So if you've just got, a great soccer player, just kind of running loosely down the field without the ball, and, he's just, kind of getting into the offensive play or whatever, it's not going to necessarily jump to him based on this. It's looking for certain specific sports related motions that, you can think of as being, intrinsic to those sports.
And that fits for soccer, basketball, and volleyball. And I've just got to say, I haven't had the benefit of using this feature yet, but I know people who have, and this is borderline magic to me, what these engineers have done.
That's a good way to put it. And I will say this, because an inevitable question, yeah, isn't it? An inevitable question that comes up is, well, that's great that you can do it for basketball, volleyball, for soccer. But what about other sports? And when we first learned of this feature, I mean, I remember specifically, it was me. I asked the engineers, is it theoretically possible that via firmware we could see additional sports added? They were very careful not to promise, oh yeah, there's going to be a bunch more upcoming. They were very, very careful not to say that. So please don't say that funny looking guy on Steve's podcast said, oh, there's going to be lots of sports, because that's not what I'm saying. But they did say, yes, it is theoretically possible that we could see additional sports added. What sports, if we will, when, Whether it takes a new product, an R1 Mark II or something, who knows? All I'm saying is it's potentially possible.
I love it. Just magic. All right. Page 3 is a way easier one than it was the last time we did this show, because we don't have auto. Well, we have auto, but we don't have auto, case 1, case 2, case 3, case 4, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the character of how servo autofocus works. And you really only have 2 options now, and that is auto, where you can still change some of the character, and then you have the manual setting that gives you access to the 2 specific settings that you can change. So let's go into, what do these do? What are our options here?
Okay. Keep in mind, if you're a Canon user and you have an older Canon camera that has, case 1, case 2, case 3, and so on. Okay. The concepts are basically going to be similar. It just requires, as you said, Steve, this simplifies it greatly for people who have the newer cameras.
Right.
I want to start by saying, why the heck would we even have any of this in the camera in the first place? Again, I'm going to keep referencing him. There's dozens of other photographers I could mention too, but Jeff Cable, the Olympic photographer, is a very skilled and experienced sports photographer, and he shoots a lot of different sports. He's not just a one-trick pony.
Right.
Anybody who has a lot of experience shooting, whether it's moving wildlife, birds in flight, and so on, or sports, is going to tell you there are lots of different types of subject movement. If you start breaking it down, when you go out to photograph a sporting event, not all movement is the same.
Right.
There's some movement that tends to be very steady and continuous coming toward the camera, or going away from the camera. There's other movements that tend to be, they can change speed quickly. They can kind of change direction quickly and stuff. To the focusing system in the camera, that matters. And as smart as our focusing systems have gotten, they still can use a little coaching in terms of, okay, what types of movement as the photographer do you generally expect? Obviously, unexpected things can happen, but in general, what is the character of the movement you think you're likely to be encountering? Critical photographers working with like a 400 millimeter f2.8, where you got very limited depth of field, a 600 f4 lens, or longer lenses even. Obviously this stuff really starts to matter when they want that critical sharpness. Okay, all that out of the way. Instead of using individual numbered examples of different types of movement, the system is now got enough processing power and speed that it can internally identify, as soon as it starts to see a subject moving, it can identify, okay, this is likely to be steady movement. This is likely to be inconsistent movement. And it can make the adjustments it needs to on its own. So Case Auto is going to cover you much of the time, even if you are a critical working pro like a Jeff Cable and so on. There's obviously other sports photographers who could rattle off their names too. But Jeff's a personal friend like he is with you, so I'm happy to give him a little love. As you noted here, if you're in the auto setting like you are now, if you hit the rate button, in this case on the back of the camera, you highlight then the Case Auto character. So, and now if you hit set, that's highlighted. Now if you hit set, okay, you can see that we've got the ability to tell the system, okay, if we move that over towards locked on, we're telling the system, hey, with our tracking and so on, keep in mind what we said about tracking. It's not just focusing on something continuously, but following it around and so on, even if it's one athlete amongst a bunch of others or whatever. We're telling the system with locked on, hey, once we're on a subject, try extra hard to keep on that subject, even if there's like an interference or, something. Responsive is telling the system, hey, as soon as something else comes into the picture or comes, kind of into the area, it's okay to go to that new subject. You might be photographing like, multiple birds. And, you start with one, but you may not want to stay with it. Something else may come in front of it, and it's like, "Ooh, that's interesting too." Boy, oh boy, it'll let you go to it more quickly. So you can tune case auto character with this setting here.
Okay, that makes total sense. And then I hit OK. I get the one that I want, and then you can also, I see, hit the trash can for the default set based on what you need.
Right, but you can just go back to.
Yeah, gotcha. So then manual lets me adjust two settings, not just how the auto responds to lock it on or be a little bit more adaptive. It gives me tracking sensitivity and acceleration, deceleration tracking.
Yeah, this kind of gets you back without using the numbered cases that we had before, case 1, case 2, and all that. This kind of gets you back to that level of control. You're saying here, okay, I, the photographer, want to tell the system a little more precisely. Tracking sensitivity means how long are we going to stay locked on to a subject once we've identified it and put a box around it. And you see here, instead of just like, a 1, 2, or 3 setting, we've actually got like a middle setting as well, where we can go in the locked on direction, or conversely, we can speed up the process of changing from one subject to another if we go toward responsive. I give you an example quickly of this is just, one example of why would a photographer want to be able to change quickly from one to another. And I think of, like a photographer working behind the finish line at an event like a major marathon, the Boston Marathon, the New York Marathon. Your job as a photographer at the finish line, you may not be there to capture like the person that finishes like in 1700th place. But as far as like the top, 20 finishers or whatever, your job is to get them, kind of coming across the line. So first athlete comes in, click, click, click. If there's another person right kind of next to them, behind them, adjacent to them, you may want to be able to quickly get off that first finisher and get onto the second one, rapidly. This is going to tell the system, hey, leave that first one and go to the second one when I just start to move the camera slightly or whatever. So there isn't a delay where it's saying, wait a minute, I want to hold on to this first person.
Oh, that's a great example. And then what about acceleration, deceleration?
This is another interesting one. Now, we've had this in previous EOS cameras. Once again, it's part of the cases for Servo AF. We talked about different types of subject movement. There are times when you know that you are going to be photographing a subject. Now, it can be moving at a fairly steady, slow speed, or it could be moving, really fast, like an Indy race car. But you know that the speed of that subject is going to be pretty consistent. It's not suddenly slowing down and speeding up. It's not changing speeds on you. Okay. If you set the system for Accel decel tracking in the plus direction, you're telling the system, hey, expect that steady, continuous movement. Conversely, if you go the other way, you're telling the system, hey, expect stops and starts, and for the autofocus to be ready to adjust to it and not to start freaking out if all of a sudden, wait a minute, I thought the subject was going to be here and now it isn't that far or whatever. Or it came closer than I thought it was going to. So this is something that, again, your experienced wildlife photographers, sports photographers, and other people that shoot different types of, hardcore, hardcore is not the right term, but it's shoot, action pictures seriously.
Right.
Especially if they're using long telephotos with very limited depth of field. You're giving them an element of control that, again, we had previously in a different, you saw different things in the menu, but it gave you the same types of control.
And this is the perfect example of why I said at the beginning of this, I don't want to do all of this through the lens and show you all the difference. I'd almost, the way my brain works, have to do it for every single thing. This is something you need to try and find out if you need to customize this for your genre or subject choice of shooting and for your shooting style as well. So that brings us to page 4. And page 4 most of these have kind of been here for a long time, or at least some of them have. But let's run through page 4 really quick. Servo first image priority.
We'll get right on this, Steve. So I just want to you don't have to change the screen, but I just want to follow up on the last comment you made a moment ago before we went to this screen.
Okay.
Where you said that you talked about how, this is going to give you an opportunity and each of you has to kind of make up your own mind and all that. I'm going to give everybody, whether you're at the highest end photographing in the Olympics or whether you're, kind of just getting your feet wet photographing youth sports and high school sports and stuff like that. Don't make this complicated. My advice to people in the beginning, even the Jeff Cables of the world, is try the case auto first. Shoot it the way you would. I don't care if you're shooting, little kids playing t-ball or whatever it might be. Shoot it the way you would and see what your results are. There's no such thing as a focusing system that's going to get every single shot perfect in every situation. But, the technology we have in the modern mirrorless world, again, not just Canon, but, across the industry,
right,
is remarkable. And most of the times, these systems are going to nail it a lot more than they won't. If you haven't seen problems, don't go looking for them. Don't just say, oh, I had 3 shots out of focus, so I need to change my, my tracking sensitivity and I need to change, it may come to that if you see a persistent tendency for not getting the results you want, but try everything zeroed out on auto first and look at the results in the computer, not just, quick and flipping through quickly on the back of the camera, and then start to ascertain what you need to do. Sorry for the interruption.
No, please. All the time. Great advice, because the technology is so good today. So Servo first image priority.
This one is telling the system, okay, assuming that you're shooting with the drive set to continuous advance, whether you're talking 40 frames a second on an R1 or whether you're talking, 3 or 5 frames a second, whatever it might be.
Right.
When you're in servo, you push the shutter button down to start shooting continuously. For the first picture you take, it's telling the system for the timing of that first frame, when you first mash the button all the way, do you want to give priority to making sure that that first shot is in confirmed sharp focus? Or are you more concerned about capturing that moment and not having a possible, quarter of a second or whatever delay to confirm focus before the shutter actually fires? So they give you they give you a middle starting point. They call it equal priority, where the system, is basically pretty smart and able to kind of, without delaying things too much, is able to, give you, most of the time a good sharp first picture without making you wait perceptibly. But again, there are certain photographers who say, hey, no matter what, this has to be sharp. And there are other photographers who say, look, I'm shooting this for newspaper. It's, obviously we want it sharp, but I mean, if it isn't like absolutely tack sharp, that's not the important thing. So that's the purpose of here. Servo first image priority when we're in servo autofocus.
Okay. Makes sense. One shot AF release priority.
Basically the same thing when we're in one shot. When we're locking focus with a stationary subject. If you go back to the Canon digital SLRs, the 5D series, the 7D series, and so on, most of those were tuned so that when you were in one shot autofocus, stationary subject, you're going to lock focus on a stationary subject. They were tuned that they wouldn't let you take a picture unless the camera confirmed the subject was sharp. It was a focus priority system. And in the early cameras, that was it. If you focused on something that didn't have a lot of detail, and then you said, okay, shoot the picture, and it hadn't confirmed sharp focus for whatever reason, you could sit there and push that button all day, and the camera wouldn't fire the shutter.
While it was hunting.
Release priority is telling the system, hey, give me priority for actually firing the shutter when I tell it to, even if the camera has not been able to confirm sharpest possible focus in that one shot situation. The moment is more important than actual sharpest possible, sharpness at the subject.
Okay. Preview AF, and there's only two options here, enable or disable.
Right. Preview AF, I know we had this discussion when we met a few years ago about what Canon then called continuous AF. Now they've kind of come to their senses, if I can be allowed to say that, and they've changed the wording to preview AF. Your camera, if you have like an original R5 or an original R6, it'll still say continuous AF. It's the same thing.
Okay.
What it is, first off, it has nothing to do with servo autofocus, as we've been discussing. This has nothing to do with the focusing system being able to focus on moving subjects as they come toward the camera or whatever. This is basically telling the system, hey, if the camera is turned on and awake, in other words, we flip it on and then tap the shutter button to wake it up. Focusing is active and live. I don't have to have my finger on the shutter button halfway for autofocus to be initiated. In the modern world, one of the biggest reasons to have the preview AF is when you're setting up a camera just like Steve and I have here today, where I've got a camera sitting right in front of my computer, up elevated a little bit, and it's on me. And I want the autofocus to just be on continuously. So that if I, move forward or whatever, or, move back, the focusing system in the camera will kind of keep up with me, and I don't have to have my finger at the shutter button activating it on and off. The other thing is that preview AF, or the old continuous AF, could be useful in remote control applications.
Oh.
Wildlife photographer, setting up a shot outside of a cave, a bird's nest or something, might want the ability for focus to actually be able to shift a little bit, especially since we now have subject detection capability. This is basically going to give them the ability, without having to actually have a finger on a shutter button, to have the camera live, autofocus active, and if it sees movement or whatever, it'll just, adjust focus as needed. Obviously, the preview AF or the old continuous AF, depending on the camera you're using, requires a certain amount of battery power for that focusing to be live all the time when my finger isn't pushing the button down halfway. So just understand, if battery conservation is an important thing for you, be ready to turn it off when you don't need it.
Yeah. Or have, some kind of external power going to it. Again, I think of David Bergman all the time. This would be great for cameras that he put up in the raft, flew up on the truss over the drummer from behind Luke Combs. This would be a fantastic feature for something like that. Lens drive when AF impossible. Again, you only have two options here. You've got continuous focus search on or stop focus search. Explain these options.
We've probably all run into this situation in the past and at some time or other. And you can especially run into it with long telephoto lenses or with macro lenses. It's not exclusively for those. You can run into it with a standard zoom lens, but it's especially acute with those kind of lenses. Basically, if you go to start autofocus and for whatever reason, the focusing system can't find something to focus on. You go to photograph that eagle flying across the sky, and, you were a little slow bringing the camera to your eye, and all the autofocus system is seeing is just sky and clouds. There may not be enough detail there for it to actually begin to latch onto something, especially if it started with the lens at a minimum focus position and then has to go towards infinity or vice versa. We've all been in situations where the camera would kind of hunt back and forth, like that.
Oh, yes.
We lose time, we lose focus and all that kind of thing. It's giving us the ability here to tell the system, all right, go. I don't think I'm going to be way out of range that often. Just let the camera search and find focus. But I can also say, hey, when we start, thinking we need to hunt here, it'll just stop. And especially with those lenses, which most of the RF lenses are now, that have the full-time manual focusing capability. That means, and this is the same with EF lenses as well, if you're using, a digital SLR or an adapted, EF lens on a mirrorless camera in a Canon system. It gives you the ability to stop for a second, take your finger off the button, manually turn the focusing ring to get you closer to where you need to be, and then let the system take over again. So
Okay.
stop focus search can buy you a little time if you think you might be running into this.
Yeah, that makes total sense. So last one on menu number 4 is AF assist beam firing. Again, 3 options here: the basic, enable, and disable, and then the LED AF assist beam only.
Okay. We have focus assist beams for, the capabilities of the modern mirrorless cameras. I keep saying this, in different contexts, but the ability for these cameras to focus even in ridiculously dim situations is remarkable. And again, I want to be clear. You can be talking about any of the major camera brands. We'd be having exactly the same discussion. Compared to where we were with, SLRs, a decade ago or whatever, there's been a big advance here.
What we have now compared to 10 years ago is magic. It is 10 years ago, you'd think what we have now is magic.
Oh, it's a stuff of dreams. It's a stuff of dreams.
Yeah.
I mean, if I could have gotten teleported from the year 2010 to now, and you showed me, modern cameras now, I'd have thought I died and gone to heaven.
Yeah.
But anyway, we have on most of our cameras a small amber-colored LED assist beam on the front of the camera that if you are in a very dim situation, and especially if the camera doesn't see much detail at the subject, whether it's linear detail or actual texture or whatever, it'll fire that little LED assist beam on the camera body. Now, obviously, with some lenses, the lens, if you have a big 300, the 100 to 300 2.8 zoom lens, it's pretty big in the front. It's going to block the beam. I mean, so it's rendered kind of useless. And the other thing too is even if you have a modest sized lens where the AF assist beam could work and you're fairly close to your subject, because this isn't a searchlight. I mean, it's just a small LED. It sheds a little light on the subject to give the system something to focus with. But there are going to be times where you may be in a situation where you don't want that showing up because you don't want subjects to see it and realize that, oh, that guy's about to take a picture of me. A candid shots at a wedding or something.
Concert photography. Yeah.
Exactly. Oh, there you go. That too. Or you may not want it to be in other people's pictures because it actually can happen. So disabling it lets you turn that off. Now, you also have focus assist in our modern speed lights. I can't speak to third-party flashes that go onto the accessory shoe, but with Canon speed lights, they also have a focus assist system built into them as well. Now, once again, we take a little trip down memory lane. In the SLR days, we had, I don't have one of those flashes here to show you, but on the front of, mid-range and high-end speed lights, you had a dark red panel that had an LED behind it that would shoot out a near infrared pattern beam with stripes on it. It would let the lens focus even in total darkness. It actually worked pretty well. The problem is, for technical reasons, that type of AF assist on the flash doesn't work with mirrorless because it is a near infrared type of light. And there's infrared cut filters over our imaging sensors where focusing is detected now on mirrorless systems. So it doesn't work. So if we try it now with a modern mirrorless camera, we basically are left to let the speed light fire a really obnoxious system of multiple rapid pops of light. Pop, 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 pop. It sheds light on a subject and lets you illuminate it. But I mean, you got the same chance in a candid situation of people not noticing you as I do of hitting my Powerball number this week. So it is not the right answer in some situations. So when we say the option for LED assist only means that we're talking either a continuous LED lighting in the modern flash units or relying on the camera body's LED system here. And we're telling the system, hey, no rapid repeating flash if I've got a Canon speed light on the camera.
Okay. Yeah, that makes, again, total sense. So page 5 of the AF, and this one is labeled customized controls. And this is the one I use a lot. I've every time I get a new camera, this is like the page I go to. Limit AF areas. We have all the AF areas here. We've already covered what these AF areas mean, but they all have check marks now.
Right. When you say, hey, I want to pick my AF area, and you start to cycle through them, Steve, I know, for instance, you've said in the past that you just, for your own personal reasons, you haven't relied on the zone AF systems. And that's fine.
Right.
There's some photographers who say, I don't use the single spot, or, whatever it might be. So as you're cycling through them, you can basically select any one of them. You see now you got the kind of magenta colored box around the first one, or second one now, third one. You basically settle on one, hit the set button on your camera, and you basically uncheck the box. You're telling the system, okay, now when I go through my AF area choices, that's not going to show up. So you always have to have one of them active. You can't eliminate them all for obvious reasons. The system won't let you. But you can certainly go through and say, hey, if there's some here that I know I'm not going to use these, you're not going to hurt anything by leaving them on, but you can turn them off and just speed up the cycling through the available choices.
And this is probably how I would have mine set. I'd have the first four, and I'd have whole area, probably, knowing me. For most of my shoots, that's probably all that I would ever need. So then,
exactly.
Orientation linked AF. This is a critical feature to me. I know people who don't set it. I don't understand it. I don't pretend to understand it. I know people who leave it on same for horizontal and vertical. Explain.
Yeah, this was something as we, as the photography industry, once again, I'm taking a trip down memory lane. I know some of you viewers don't care about what cameras are like in the 1990s and into the early 2000s, but,
right.
It's sometimes helpful to just know where we're coming from. When we started having cameras, autofocus cameras, it got away from just a single focusing point in the center in the early days to having multiple focusing points. We could, pick one here. We could pick one at the top. We could pick one at the bottom, left, right, etc. A perfect example is a person who's shooting shots of people. This might not apply to you, Steve, with the band photography and music photography you do, but it might very well be for somebody doing other types of people pictures where it would make sense to have, for your horizontal orientation, if you can see my camera here, with the camera held horizontally, it might make perfect sense to have a focusing point or a focusing area that's up above the center line, but, kind of in the center of the picture. You certainly could move it left or right or whatever. But the point is, it's not just in the dead center. The idea is that now I can just pick the camera up for a horizontal shot, and I got a good likelihood that my subject's face is going to be at or near where that focusing point is. It's not in the center anymore. But what happens if I turn the camera vertical? Now that centered focusing point is way off to one side, and that's probably not going to be cool. So again, I'm a people photographer. I could put a second point for my vertical shots, again, north of the center line and probably in the middle or something, but up 2/3 or something. And now when I go vertical, it'll change the focusing point location for starting, and it'll allow me to, get an early jump on being able to focus on that person in a vertical shot. Return the camera to a horizontal orientation, and the focusing points change. That's what orientation linked AF in the Canon system means. Many other competitive brands of cameras have something like this. They probably call it different things, but the point is they have it. Now, as far as the two choices, separate AF points, and it says area plus point. I can tell the system, if I choose this, that when I do my horizontals, maybe I want just a single 1-point autofocus. And I move it, up above the center line or whatever. But for whatever reason, when I go to verticals, I may want to change that. Maybe I want zone AF with a bigger zone.
Okay.
Maybe I want spot AF with an even narrower spot, whatever. With this setting, I can now not only choose different locations for horizontal and vertical, but I can also have different AF areas for each one. I only have one choice for each. I can't say, give me 3 different choices for horizontal and vertical. For horizontal, say. But I can pick a starting point for horizontals. I can pick a starting point for verticals. And then I can always move the focusing point or change the area. But the point is I think you understand what I'm saying. I can choose a different AF area to start with for my horizontals and for my verticals. The third option, I'm just changing the AF point location. Whatever AF area I start with, I'm going to get the same one when I turn the camera vertically.
So it's slightly more restrictive, but than the middle one. And I use this because a lot of times when I'm photographing concerts, I move my focus point to like a rule of thirds up and to the right or up and to the left to put the singer or guitarist or whatever face where I want it. When I turn vertical, I'm again going to want that on a vertical framing now, up and to the right or up and to the left. So
exactly.
I need it to move with me, the way that I'm you understand what I mean. Limit
Exactly.
subject to detect. This one to me is kind of a minor thing, but an understandable one. And that is, I don't want it to pick a car. I don't want it to pick a cat. I only want it to pick people in a scene. Am I simplifying this too much?
No, but here's the thing. I'm not responding to what you just said, but just so that people don't get the wrong idea. Understand that this is strictly when you're rifling through your different choices. Are there some choices that I'm never going to use? I'm a race car photographer. I'm never shooting animals. I'm not a wildlife.
It's going to be people or cars.
Right. So I can just speed up what I'm cycling through when I pick a subject to detect by omitting one or more. Okay. I am absolutely not telling the system, hey, if I've got all of these checked, that, it's going to automatically pick the type of subject it is, from a car to a person or something. It isn't that. It's just when I make my choices, do I want all my choices available, or do I want to speed it up by eliminating some that I don't need? And you can always bring it back by just, putting a check mark back there with the set button if you change your mind later and, decide, right, hey, I shoot race cars, but now I am going to go on a safari to Africa.
And it's because you've selected the one, for example, here, you're limiting which one you can choose. Okay, that makes sense.
Exactly.
Left, right eye detection.
Yeah, we kind of talked about this before. Here, we're telling the system, hey, just lock yourself in to, as far as eye detection, when I'm making my choices, do I want my choices to include everything? Or do I just feel like, hey, that business about select the subject's right eye, select subject's left eye, it's like, I'm not going to do that. The system works fine on automatic. I could eliminate those from the choices if I wanted to.
Okay, makes sense. Page 6, almost done with the AF menus. Manual focus peaking settings, currently set to off. Your options are peaking level and color.
Yeah, manual focus peaking. I'll admit, when I first saw it, it came to our still camera industry from our cinema and video cameras. That's where we first saw this feature. And what it does is basically when we're manually focusing, it's not an autofocus thing. When we're manually focusing, as you turn your focus ring, basically you will start to get a colored fringe around any parts of the scene that at a given moment are sharp. So if I start focusing my lens and when I pick the camera up, it happened to be focused toward infinity, you'll see that, as I turn the ring, some background elements sort of have this colored fringe on them. It could be red, blue, or yellow. But then as I continue turning the lens to focus closer, that's moving towards things that are nearer and nearer to the camera. Basically, it's giving you another way of assessing sharpness visually in a manual focusing scenario, other than just observing the view go blurry and sharp. It still does that, but on top of that, now you'll see this fringing. The cool thing about focus peaking when you're in a situation where you can see it clearly, because sometimes it can be hard to see, depending on the light and so on. But the cool thing about it is that you can quickly ascertain the sharpness across the whole picture area. So as you are turning the focus ring, moving toward a nearby subject or moving toward infinity, you can not only see is my subject in focus, assuming it's toward the center of the frame just for discussion's sake, but you can also start to see if any, what background or foreground elements are in focus as well, by what starts to show that colored fringe. When it's not in focus, the colored outlines sort of disappear. You don't see them there. The one disadvantage, aside from the fact that sometimes it can be difficult to see for certain people, is that
Me?
okay, that happens. Is that it's not always like absolutely, you know, totally precise. There's a little bit of wiggle room as for instance, Steve, if you were taking my picture right now, if you were, standing in front of me and you composed it just like we see on the screen here, and trying to focus on my face and my eyes and so on. As you turn the ring, you can start to see that reddish fringe or yellowish fringe or whatever appearing around the outlines where there's contrast on my face. So you wouldn't see it in the middle of my forehead, but you would see it around, my eyes and, my nose and so on. The problem is that there's a little bit of wiggle room in it. You start to see that colored outline around my eyes, and you think, great, I got it. It may be that it's just like a little front focused or a little back focused. It can be off a little bit. It's a great way to get yourself in a good approximate state of sharpness. But just understand that that's a limitation of focus peaking, as I've seen it in Canon cameras anyway.
Yeah, and
otherwise, I like it. I use it a lot.
When I'm in manual focus, I live by it. But I also understand I don't trust it as much as autofocus. My eyes aren't great either, so I'm in deep trouble in manual focus. But low and high, I always set it to high because I really need that fringe to be super bright. But I can't see the red very good. So I always choose yellow. I kind of wish it defaulted to yellow, honestly. But being red-green colorblind, I have to use the yellow for it to really pop a contrast against the scene that I'm in.
Yeah, I can easily see how that could be the case for somebody that has some degree of color blindness. And then in addition, even if you technically don't have color blindness, I can easily see that, there's some types of lighting and contrast and other things where one color may be really faint as you turn the lens back and forth. But then if you try another one, it may, the blue kind of jumps here. Okay, we'll use that for now. So that's the purpose of the three colors. It'd be cool if you had extra ones, but none of our cameras to date have.
Yeah, and actually, if you were shooting, like a warm, bright, yellowish sunset, you wouldn't want to use yellow, right? So it makes sense. And then correct me if I'm wrong. The level high-low is kind of like a brightness,
right? As far as not the whole picture area, but just this colored fringe appearance. Normally I leave it on.
How bright and contrasty the lines are.
Yeah.
Focus guide on or off.
Focus guide is another manual focusing aid that came to us from our cinema and video background. I mentioned a moment ago that when we go to focus peaking, that one characteristic of it, which can be kind of cool, is that as you manually focus your lens, you can see that color changing and moving as different things come into focus around the whole picture area. Focus guide kind of conceptually is different. What it does is it gives you a single focusing box that you can freely move around. It's kind of, you can think of it almost like one point autofocus, but it's not autofocus. We're talking manual focus here.
Right.
Yeah. So the camera's got to be in manual focus for you to use this. But with a single focusing point, which you can move, you put that focusing point on a particular part of a subject or a particular subject, and then you start to turn the focus ring. And above the box, you see these little arrows, these little white arrows that move as you adjust the focus. And when you get to a point where the system thinks, okay, at this point right now, where the box is, we have what the camera thinks is perfect focus. The two arrows come together and they turn green. And the other cool thing is that if you go, front focused, back focused, they actually change the shape of the little lines or arrows. So once you've experienced with it, you can tell at a glance whether you're focused too far in the background or too close for this particular subject that you're aiming it at. It's, it restricts you to using just focus detection at that one box. But the cool thing is you could argue that it's more accurate, especially if you're working quickly, than the focus peaking, which, like I say, gets you pretty darn close in the ballpark, but you can argue that it's not exact.
And I will say I love this feature because it reminds me of, the old days growing up where we had SLRs, not DSLRs. We had the little 2 half circles that we would move back and forth when we focused, right?
Yeah.
This is a very, very handy feature to me. And then the last one on page 6 is lens electronic manual focus. And again, you got lots of options on this one.
Yeah, and this one, you can go into the weeds with this. So I don't want to do that here. I'm certainly going to go through what the choices are and so on, but understand there are a couple of variables that you don't see just with these choices here.
Okay.
One of them immediately is we're talking manual focusing when your lens is set to autofocus. And we're talking about RF lenses, which up to date, all of them, the manual focusing is electronic. In other words, I turn the focus ring with an RF lens. I know it's not coming into focus here, but I turn the manual focus ring. It isn't like on older SLR lenses where I was turning a mechanical helicoid, a threaded helicoid, and moving optical elements to change my focus. With this, as I turn the ring, I am literally sending a series of electronic signals to the focusing motor, the same one that's used for autofocus, and telling it now, instead of doing it yourself, hey, when I turn the lens this way, start moving the focusing elements to let me focus nearer to my subject and vice versa. Electronic manual focusing. That's what that means.
Hold on. I'm in autofocus mode. I reach up and I grab the manual focus ring. I start turning it, which tells it, no, I want to override your autofocus. Let's take a hypothetical. I change the focus a lot. Autofocus had it here. I changed the focus to here manually. I let go and I stop turning that manual ring. Is there a point where it will kick back to the auto? Is that only when I hit an AF button? And as long as I don't hit an AF button, my manual focus holds?
Yeah, that's true. That's correct.
Okay. All right.
And that's a little bit why I started a little preamble saying that there's a couple of things here that can influence this. But the first thing I wanted to get across is just to understand that when we say lens electronic MF, this isn't like just for a couple of lenses like it used to be.
Right.
With the digital SLRs and the EF lenses, where there were only a handful of lenses that focused manually, electronically. Now, all of the RF lenses to date, as of early 2025, use electronic manual focus. Okay, that out of the way. One thing that can change what I'm about to tell you with these as we go through them is if you go in, I'm not saying let's do this, but if you go into your customized buttons, and this isn't just for the newest R5 Mark II and R1, this could be with an original EOS R or, an original R5 or R6 or, whatever. If you go into your customized buttons and you tell it for the shutter button, you tell it, hey, for a half press, I don't want you to activate autofocus. Let the camera wake up with metering. And then when I fully press it, let it take a picture. But I want my autofocus activation to be with one of the back buttons exclusively.
You just described me.
Yeah. The behavior of this lens electronic manual focus and the full time manual focusing changes a bit depending on how you have your shutter button set.
Okay.
So I'm going to tell you the way it generally is, but if you try this on your camera and you say, wait a minute, that weird looking guy on Steve's podcast had it wrong. My camera's not doing that. It can very well be dependent on how you have the shutter button activation set for a half press.
Okay.
So just keep that in mind. Okay. There are times that photographers are working in autofocus. All this has to do with the cameras in autofocus. There are times the photographer is working in autofocus and just says to him or herself, I don't want any manual focusing. I have the way I hold the camera, I sometimes inadvertently turn it slightly. I don't want any chance of things shifting out of focus or anything. I'm 100% confident in my autofocus. Just let the autofocus do its thing as long as I'm set for autofocus on the lens. Okay, fine. Disable. That's what you're telling it. No manual focus unless I switch out of autofocus and to manual focus on the lens, the AF MF switch. Disable after one shot means that if I'm in the one shot autofocus mode, I have basically said, I focus on something with one shot, I've locked focus. Even if I turn the ring accidentally, don't let it do anything. One shot enabled is the opposite. And this can actually be kind of useful because if you are in one shot autofocus, stationary subject, you're going to focus on something with your autofocus, lock focus, and hold the button down to keep it locked. You can now turn the ring and you can now manually override what you focused on. You can, tweak it slightly. You could say, hey, wait a minute. I should have focused on the background, not the foreground. Bingo, you can go to the background, whatever. Same thing for the next one shot enabled magnify, except now this is kind of a handy thing that you never had with SLRs. As you lock focus in one shot autofocus with a stationary subject. If you then decide, hey, I want to tweak this autofocus a little bit. I want to tweak this focus to get a little more sharpness here, there, whatever. Around the area of wherever your active focusing area was, as you start to turn the ring, it'll actually magnify it on screen. So you get a magnified view of what the sharpness is. Now, obviously, with a moving subject, that can be kind of challenging. But with a stationary subject, again, a macro photographer, I think, could really fall in love with that feature. This can really let you, confirm that, your focus was dead on, or, if you say, I want to tweak this slightly, you can get a pretty good view of it because whatever the area was around the focusing point, that could be in the center, could be off center, it'll magnify that. So it's kind of cool. Enable
I like that.
Enable actual size. The next one, the actual size is a little confusing here. I would have, if it was up to me, and of course it isn't, nobody asked me, but I would change the wording of that actual size in parentheses. But enable is basically telling the system, hey, I'm allowing myself to be able to, I can be in servo, I can be in one shot, whatever. I'm allowing myself to be able to just pick the camera up and just turn the ring and immediately manual focus it as long as the camera is active and turned on. Again, the behavior is a little different if you've customized your shutter button so that autofocus is no longer activated here at all. So you may have to experiment a little bit and just sort of see, where your comfort is. One other thing I should mention here is that, again, with some of the other cameras in the system, if you think of the less expensive cameras, some of our APS-C cameras that are, designed to be at a, more attractive price point, they don't have all these options. So don't, with all the stuff we've been talking about up to now, people, don't freak out if some of the stuff we're talking about isn't on your camera. Okay. We're using the high-end cameras. Again, I'm repeating what Steve said at the beginning. We're using the high-end cameras to, show like what all the potential options are for autofocus. Don't get upset if you see things that you don't see on your camera.
Yeah. This gives us the broadest pool of options to touch and mess with, even though you may not have them all.
Right. And then the last one, enable, and then in parentheses, one shot magnify. It's saying, first off, I can just, most of the time, I can just pick the camera up. As long as the camera's on and awake, I can just start turning the manual focus ring and the focus will actually start moving, even though the lens is set for autofocus. But it's also saying that, hey, if I pick the camera up with one shot autofocus, lock focus on a stationary subject, if I turn it, it'll magnify the image again. So it's a little different from the one shot enabled magnified up above, in that it basically is allowing me, in some situations anyway, to just start manually focusing, even if I haven't locked focus first with one shot. It's a little confusing. Don't panic if you try to wrap your mind around it. And the first few times you do it, it's like you're thinking, okay, wait a minute, what am I seeing here? It can be a little weird. It's all good.
And that goes back to, you need to get the camera in your hand, hold your camera as we're talking about these, go out, play with these settings and see how because again, like Rudy said, depending on how you have your half press shutter button set, some of these may not work for you at all or may work differently. So you're going to have to go out and kind of play with them a little bit and see if they're even for you at all. So the last menu for autofocus is register, recall, autofocus related settings, and AF setting guide URL. Page 7 on the autofocus menu. What do we got?
Again, this is going to be exactly the same on the R5 Mark II and on the R1 that we're using now. The focusing systems on these two cameras are essentially identical. So just let's make sure we're clear on that. Okay, as far as this one is concerned, this is another one. I'm going to be honest, full confession here. When we first got samples of the R5 Mark II and then the R1 and, started to learn the cameras and all that, I saw what this was. I saw this menu item. I understood what it basically was, and I never really tried it. I just said, okay, it's there for people who need it. Let's explain why it's there. Basically, you can go in here. In fact, if you hit your set button there to see what the choices are, it's where it says register settings. If you can hit set one more time, you'll see that it gives you 6 possible areas or banks or whatever where you can go in, and it basically is asking you, before you enter this menu area, set the auto-focusing features and so on the way you want to use the focusing system in a given scenario. Maybe sometimes you're photographing birds in flight, and through your own experience, you've got different things, not just servo autofocus, but you got a bunch of other things that you want anytime you photograph birds in flight. You can go in here now and basically memorize those. And you see down the bottom, it says info name settings. You don't have to commit it to memory. You can actually say, birds or flying birds or whatever. There's a limited how many characters, but I mean, you can use this little, keyboard here, to give it a name. So you don't have to memorize it. And a month later, you're trying to remember what's that one? What's that two? You could have another one if you were, if you were a fashion photographer that did runway fashion. Your focusing needs may be very different from a photographer doing birds in flight. Again, you could have another set for, runway, and you could, again, go into the camera first, set everything individually, and then basically it'll ask you, okay, activate those settings here for set 2 and so on. Now, time for a confession. And that is, when I tried this in preparation for your show, Steve, I realized that there is no way that I could find. Maybe I took too many stupid pills that morning or whatever, but I could not find a way to clear those settings. The idea is that I can kind of set a semi-permanent set of settings that I can go back to. If I'm that hypothetical runway photographer shooting fashion, the next time I do a runway fashion, I could just simply pick set 2 and bingo, all those settings are active. So far, so good. But if I change jobs and I'm not shooting runway fashion anymore, and I know I'm not going to, there is no way I could see to just clear that and just go back to, okay, a blank set 2 that I can reset to something else later. I have asked my colleagues at Canon Inc. at Canon USA to reach out to the engineers in Japan to give us clarity on this. Because right now, I can't see a way to cancel that and clear it. I'm sure
that's got to be an omission.
There's got to be a way. And I will, as soon as I find an answer that makes sense, I will get back to you so that you can put it in the comments under the YouTube video and so on.
All right.
The idea of this is to be able to have a semi-permanent way to go back to repeating situations. And I mean, it could get really granular. I mean, again, I'll use the example of a Jeff Cable shooting different types of sports. He might have a way he likes to use his autofocus for water polo. He might have a different way he likes to use his autofocus for gymnastics, like his wonderful Simone Biles pictures that he showed on your podcast and so on. But, the point is he can quickly call up any of these that he has gone to the trouble of previously memorizing. I will do what I can to get clarity for you about, okay, how do you clear it if you just find, okay, I'm not shooting gymnastics anymore. So anyway,
And then the nice thing is, as you set each one, you set up the autofocus the way you want it. You come in and you register and rename, let's say, set one, but then on set one, you can choose which, we've already discussed all of these, but you can choose which attributes of the autofocus configuration are assigned to
you want to include. But you are going to need, at least as far as I could tell, once again, I'm doing a little head scratching here, and I don't have much hair left to scratch on, but it seems like you need to preset a lot of these in the camera first, which will take a little time. I mean, sitting in the hotel room or at home to go through and pick your focus area, and so on and so on.
And then you would recall them if you have one set, obviously, to choose the one you want.
Right.
Okay.
Now, let me throw this out as well before we leave this. I mentioned already a couple of times with regard to this, that the idea is to have a semi-permanent way of being able to go back and recall settings that I know I'm likely to use for a given moving subject scenario.
Right.
Okay. It doesn't have to be sports. I mean, it could be wildlife, birds in flight, whatever.
In my case, it could be a live performance versus a meet and greet.
There you go. There you go. And if you found that, one set of focus settings work best for your meet and greets, you could, lock it in and, call it up at any time. There is also I don't want to get too deep into the weeds on customizing buttons, but one of the cool things with these cameras is you've got incredible button customization capability now. And to some degree, you even have it on our, less expensive cameras, like some of the, like an EOS R50 and an EOS R10 and so on. One of the options you have on many of the cameras is to customize a back button to recall autofocus settings. So you can go into in the case of these cameras, the green customized buttons menu. You can pick a button. That could be the AF on button. It could be the AE lock button with a little asterisk icon on the back, whatever. And you can say, okay, register and recall AF functions. And you can go in and set. It's kind of the same thing. You can tell it, okay, I want servo AF. I want, single point AF. I want my tracking on, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
The idea, though, is that now it's a temporary thing. It's once you set it, it's not going to clear the menu, but I can call it up anytime I want by pressing the button. As soon as I take my thumb off the button, it goes back to whatever my camera was set for. So it gives you another way of doing it. And to be perfectly honest, to me, initially, it makes a little more sense how to do it, setting it up in that green menu, understanding that it's only when I press the button and it toggles back to where I was before after I take my finger off the button. But it's an option, compared to doing it this way.
And I will say, at the end of the first video we did 3 years ago, I showed how I do my dual back button focus. And I mentioned something related to what you just said. And at the end of this video, because I don't want to tell people, go look at the other one for that. I'm going to do it again. I'm going to show them at the end of this video how I set up my dual back button focus and why I have it the way that I do, which is exactly what Rudy just said. So the last autofocus menu structure option is AF setting URL.
In the past, with our high-end cameras, I remember back with digital SLRs with the 7D and the 7D Mark II, certainly with the EOS 1 DX series, and now as we've gone into mirrorless, the high-end mirrorless cameras, we used to have a PDF guide. It was nicely illustrated and written and so on, that basically, it wasn't an instruction book. It went beyond the instruction book in terms of giving you, in, hopefully everyday language, why you might set something up and how to do it. Not just, okay, this is what this focusing area does, but, example, it showed you nice pictures about why and so on. Instead of going to a PDF document like we had, 4, 5, 6 years ago, they've now gone to a downloadable document. It's still a PDF, but a downloadable document that you can put on your phone. So that you have it ready so that if you're out in the field and you say, wait a minute, what the heck what is that setting? You call it up on your phone rather than, have to, hunt around, on your laptop for an old PDF document. And so if you actually, go on this and, just use it on your phone, it'll immediately take you to a link where you can download that onto your phone.
And for those of you that are watching on, or I should say, listening to the audio only podcast feed, basically what this is a QR code that lets you, scan it with your phone camera right off the back of the camera. So here's where it gets interesting. We're almost done. And I appreciate everybody waiting. This is a long episode. The first one that we did was a long episode as well. But there are some autofocus options. I shouldn't say autofocus options. Autofocus tangential related type settings, right, that are not in the autofocus menus because they may affect autofocus. They may tangentially touch the autofocus subject, but they're not actual, for sake of conversation, autofocus commands. And I'm going to go back to the one that Rudy just mentioned, and that is we're going to go to the Customize Controls menu, and specifically page number 3 in the Customize Control menu, because this is 4 commands or options that are available to you in customizing controls that are AF related, right? The first one is AF area selection control. Explain that.
Yeah, normally the default on a Canon camera is that if you want to change your AF area, spot AF, single point, AF point expansion and so on, all that stuff we were talking about, by default, the way you do it is you press the AF point selection button on the back of the camera, which is the icon you see here on the far, far left, before the arrow. Okay. And then by default, you bring your finger to the multifunction button, which is a little button. I don't know if you can see it on my camera. I know it's not in focus. But a little button right by the shutter button. It's labeled MFN, multifunction. And what you're going to do is you press the AF point select button, you can let it go. And then each press of the multifunction button toggles you through the different AF area choices. And we showed you those before. The 7 or 8 of them without the, exactly, there you go, just like that. And you can, when you get to the one you want, just stop what you're doing and you're good to go. You can then use that area and move it around and so on. One disadvantage of using the multifunction button and toggling through that way is you can't go backwards. If you just want to make a quick change and you want to go from like one point to spot AF, which is going back a point, back an area, with the button, you gotta cycle through all the choices to get back to the spot AF. You do have the choice if you just press the set button here for a second to see. You do have the option of pressing the point select button, letting it go, and then turning the main dial on the camera instead to cycle through each of the choices. But now you can turn the dial either way. So you can go backwards if you want without having to cycle through every choice. That's what this AF area selection control is all about. How do you access the different AF areas using controls on the camera? You are always free to go into the AF menu and set it on the menu itself.
And I will say this is why that one command that we showed earlier, where you can limit the AF selection options that are available to you as you go through the menus. If you're going to use that multifunction button and only be able to go one way, remove the ones that you don't use. It'll make your life a lot easier. So sensitivity AF point select.
Many of our cameras now in the mid-range and upper end have an 8-way joystick, for lack of a better phrase, that we can use to move focusing points up, down, left, right, etc. It's with this control here basically dictates how sensitive and quick that action of moving the points is going to be. If you find that, hey, I want to go from far left to far right, manually moving it with the 8-way multi-controller is what we technically call it. You'll see that there's a certain rate if you hold it down that it kind of goes from left to right or right to left or whatever. If you find that that's too fast for you, that you want to slow it down so you can more precisely get it right on the eye or something like that, you can go to the minus setting. Conversely, if you're saying to yourself, hey, there's a lot of times I just want to instantly go from, far left to far right or something. You could speed that up. It's still going to be, but it speeds up the activity as you push that 8-way multi-controller.
I think of this like on a computer, how fast you want your mouse to move across the screen.
That's perfect example. Why didn't I think of that?
Focus ring rotation.
This has to do with the direction of manual focusing. Canon cameras have always, and a few other brands have always had manual focusing, mean that when you wanted to focus on something nearer to the camera, as you're holding the camera in your hands, your hand to manually focus turned in a clockwise direction as you were, looking at the camera with it at your eye. Other camera brands like Nikon and Pentax and some others always traditionally focused the other way. It just had to do with the way they initially started designing their lenses and how they've sustained it. The cool thing here is that if you are coming from a different system and you're used to manually focusing a given way and the Canon way is the opposite, you can reverse it now because of the electronic manual focusing.
This one goes way back to me because I remember when people started using Word, and before that, everybody used WordPerfect. And there was an ability in Microsoft Word to make Microsoft Word use the keyboard shortcuts of WordPerfect. And my response to everybody is going to always be the same on something like this. If you are making a switch to Canon, learn the Canon method. It will benefit you in the long run than trying to go backward. However, if you need some help transitionally, it's wonderful that options like this are actually there for you to help you. And the last one here is RF lens manual focus ring sensitivity. I did adjust this on my camera.
Yeah, this can be a little confusing the first time you see it and try playing with it and so on. Again, keep in mind, when we're talking manual focus, activity, it's electronic in the lens. Okay, it's not mechanical like it used to be in the old days if you come from from SLRs. By default, the system is set, and this is set in the camera body that applies to any lens you mount on the camera, but it's not a setting you make on the lens. By default, as you manually focus, the amount of change in focus will vary depending on how fast you rotate the ring. If you rotate it slowly, it tries to give you kind of a fine focus, which makes a certain amount of sense. If you speed that up to get more of a quick focus shift, it'll actually speed up, not just in relation to how much you turn it, but it'll actually speed up how quickly the manual focus adjustment is. A lot of times which is the right one can even depend on what lens you're using. And I can't tell you that, with this lens, you do it this way, with this lens, you do it that way. But if you try manual focusing with a given RF lens and you find that I'm going past my focusing point, or it seems like it's a little slow, try the second one, link to rotation degree. Now it's functionally going to be a lot more like we used to have with mechanical manual focusing, where it just simply changes in relation to how far we turn it. And if we turn it fast, it doesn't kick in an extra, some extra horsepower to move the focus more than it would if we were going a little slower. So I won't say there's a right or wrong answer, but that's basically what it is. And again, we're talking manual focusing operation only. This has nothing to do with how fast your autofocus is or anything like that.
Right. And for me, this is, again, just me, your mileage may vary. The more linear method of I turn from here to here, I get this amount, worked for my brain and the way my hand worked. But again, the nice thing is, and this is what I love about, all modern cameras nowadays, we've got these options, and I think that's great. And the last autofocus option that we have here is on page 5 of the custom controls menus, and it's the eye control. And this does not exist for a lot of bodies. It exists for a couple of bodies, but the eye control, I played with it because I've got an R1 for 2 weeks, right? So I had to play with it. And this is where, by the way, when you go to register the eye control, which Rudy will describe it in a minute, but let me just tell you up front, when you go to do this for the first time, it actually pops something up and says, make sure that the diopter is set right. And the diopter was not set right for me. And I was trying to figure out the diopter and the damn thing wouldn't turn. I finally, I Googled the heck out of it. I'm thinking Google's going to have it, right? I tried ChatGPT, didn't get it there. Finally, I'm like, all right, I'll search diopter in the PDF of the manual. And sure enough, it comes up and says, pull it out to push it in to lock it, pull it out to unlock it, and set the diopter. And this was really fun to play with. So explain eye control autofocus.
I absolutely will, because for me, it's one of my favorite headline features on the R5 Mark II and the R3. Now, we also have this technology on the earlier EOS R3. Did I say R?
You said R3. I think you meant R5 Mark II and R1, and then the earlier
and
R3.
then we had it on the R3 as well, as far as our mirrorless cameras are concerned. Eye control AF is assuming that you get it to work for you, and I'll talk about that in a minute. It is the fastest way to just pick the camera up and tell it, I want to focus here. I want to focus here. I want to focus not just on the subject's, face. I want to put focus on their eye. I want to, whatever it might be. The cool thing is you pick a focus area. Again, it can be single point. It can be one of the broader areas, or whatever. And you basically simply look where you want to focus and then press the shutter button down halfway, and bingo. The eye control system reads where your eye, the photographer's eye, is looking and immediately positions a focusing area there. There are a lot of people out there who kind of don't want to like this feature. If you own one of these cameras, an R3, the new R1, new as of early 2025, or the new R5 Mark II, you owe it to yourself to give it a try. Because I'm telling you, if you get this system to work, it is fire. I mean, it is the fastest way to make the camera. It absolutely makes it a much, much more responsive camera. I'm telling you, in terms of just where am I going to focus? You can obviously use the multi-controller and move the point up, your AF areas up, down, left, right, and stuff. If you get this to work, it's like the difference between driving the family SUV and riding on a high performance motorcycle. It's night and day in terms of how quick you can be ready to shoot anywhere your subject is. And it respects your composition. You don't just have to put a focusing point in the center and move the whole camera to get something in focus, even though you really didn't want it in the center. So anyway.
Let me inject here really quick. When I set it up, it kind of freaked me out, because what would happen is as I set it up and I'm looking places, you're going to look at what you want to shoot. So regardless of how your composition is set up or how you're holding the body, if you look at point X, the dot's already there. I mean, it almost feels like the dot was there before you looked. It's so weird, but I want to stress something that didn't surprise me, but was good to get clarification on for me. And that was, it doesn't focus. It positions the focus point. You still have to press AF. You still have to hold the shutter halfway. It's just, instead of, like, for me, I don't like the multifunction controller, the joystick as it were. I use the top dial and the back dial. I know it's weird. It's just, I'm used to it from years and years and years ago. This could break me of that if I could keep this damn camera.
Yeah, it's, again, it's outstanding. I would normally go through these in sequence, but having said what we did, I'm going to ask you to go down to the bottom one, pointer display settings. There is, in addition to everything else, when you've activated your eye control, there is by default a little round icon. It almost looks like a logo for a Target department store.
Yep.
Default color is yellow. You can change the color of it if you want. We call it the pointer. The pointer is designed to, just as you look around before a shot is taken, or even depending on how you have it set up after a shot is taken, it does follow your eye. I don't normally beg Canon users when I go on to a presentation like this, Steve, but I'm gonna beg your listeners now. Turn the pointer off.
What?
So go into pointer display settings, and where the first thing, pointer display, hit the set button to see your choices, just turn it off. Here's why. I hear people all the time picking up an R3 or one of these two newer cameras, trying the eye control and saying, "Oh my, I can't use this. It's always just moving all over the place. Anywhere I look, when I go to check my background, that pointer's going there. The system isn't consistent. It wobbles around and stuff." The pointer is simply telling you, before you've locked the AF point location or afterwards, it's just simply telling you what your eyes do. You don't need to know that. I know if I'm looking upper left or lower right or whatever. Turn the pointer off. Okay? I'm done propagandizing on it, but that's the gospel according to Rudy.
Okay, anyhow, but there's three options. On, off. What is shut SHTG standby?
Shooting standby. On means that anytime you turn the eye control on with the on setting, as soon as as long as the camera's awake, when it sees your eyes at the viewfinder, that yellow pointer is there, and it's just following where your eye's going. And if you scan the background, scan the foreground, whatever it might be, it's constantly there. Shooting standby means that the pointer is there before you press the button halfway. The shutter button I'm talking about, or the AF activation button. Before you activate autofocus, then the pointer goes away. It's better than nothing, but in my opinion, you don't need the pointer. Turn it off. You're not going to break anything by doing that. You can see that the pointer does have other controls too. You can change the color. You can change its size, and you can even change it from the little bullseye logo to a little kind of a little crosshair in the center if you wanted to. None of that matters. In my opinion, just turn it off. So anyhow, that said, for eye control itself to work, the camera needs to be able to read the location of the pupil in your eye. It needs to know when your eye is at the viewfinder, are you looking up, down, left, right, whatever. You have to give it a calibration procedure first. So when you'll see that the first item on the menu there is the third item, is calibration, but there's also calibration number. The system on calibration number is giving you 6 choices so that you can tell the system, all right, that could be for 6 different photographers, up to 6 different photographers. I mean, it could be for like a husband and wife, or whatever. It could be for different situations for an individual photographer. For instance, I wear glasses a lot of times. If I'm wearing my glasses, I would want one calibration for that. As far as the eye control is concerned, what's going on with my eye is different if I don't have my glasses on.
Right.
So I would need to calibrate without glasses on another calibration channel. That could be channel 2 or 3 or whatever. Now, the cool thing is that let's just say you're like me, and, sometimes you shoot without glasses and sometimes you shoot with them. So like a good kid, you do the calibration without, you go to another number and you set a second calibration with. Down the bottom where it says select a profile, that's another example. It's kind of a poor wording. It's just basically you're naming the calibration. So that 2 months later, you don't have to try to remember. Is that the one that I set for, my significant other? Is that the one I set for me when I'm not wearing my glasses? You can just, give it a short name and so that you know it. Anyhow, so you have to do you have to do calibrations depending on how, whether you got different types of eyewear on and that kind of thing. The calibration settings, now, not the choices you have, but actually doing it, is down here. So if you go to, it says cal and hit the set button, you see it'll tell you to start the calibration. And as Steve just mentioned, it'll say, first off, make sure the diopter for the viewfinder is adjusted for your eyesight so you get a good clear view. You can delete a calibration. You know, again, if I set up a calibration for another photographer to try the camera out or something, and then, but it's my camera, I can then, you know, after my buddy is done, I can just delete that calibration if I know I'm not going to need it. So I can delete all of them, or I can pick any one of them and delete that. Now, another thing too is that I can save that calibration onto a memory card and then put it in another similar camera. Now, one thing I honestly can't remember is if you do this on like an R5 Mark II, can you transfer it over to an R3? I think the answer is no. I think it's only going to do it for the exact model that you did it with. So in other words, Steve, in your case, you have an R1 now. If I'm not mistaken, to save a calibration or more than one calibration on a card and put it in another camera, it would need to be another R1, but I'm honestly not sure.
You know, what's interesting there is that's not that big of a deal. If like me, you probably have one calibration, because if I've got, you know, two different bodies or whatever, it doesn't take that long to calibrate. But if you did set up a glasses profile and a contact lens profile and a no glasses profile, you're going to be there for a while to do multiple bodies.
Yeah, it's not the end of the world, but this is going to save you a few steps. Again,
gotcha.
The only thing I'm not sure of is, once again, if it'll transfer over to other different Canon camera bodies. A couple of things about the calibration process. Basically, when you pick calibration like Steve just had on screen, and then you hit OK, start. You're looking in the viewfinder. The camera is going to start by, it asks you to go to the multifunction button, that little button up by the shutter button labeled MFN. And it's going to start by showing you a little tiny icon in the center. And it's a little white icon against a gray background. You want to look steadily at that. And then while you're looking, don't let your eye kind of wander around. Just look square at it, keep looking at it, and then press the multifunction button and hold it. As you hold it, you will see that little tiny circle icon just kind of start to recede in size and then disappear. Then take your finger off the multifunction button. It'll immediately start blinking or showing you another same kind of circular little target. I think it's in the upper middle, I think is where it goes next. But wherever it is, look at that steadily. Don't let your eye kind of wander. Keep looking at it. Hold the button, the multifunction button down continually until it disappears. Take your finger off, and then another one starts to light up. Look over at that. Now, just look at me for a second. I'm not the prettiest face in the world, but when you're doing that, real important, a couple of things. You don't want to be moving the camera as you look from left to right. We have a tendency sometimes to kind of angle the camera a little as it's up to our face. So we kind of tend to do this stuff a little bit. You don't want to do that. You want to find a center point where you're looking right in the center of that viewfinder, and where you can just roll your eye to the left, roll it to the right, and be able to see as clearly as, you reasonably can. And it's real important that you hold that camera position when you're calibrating it, and then when you're using it. That's a problem some people have. And then the calibration starts acting wonky or whatever, and so on. Anyway, you're going to repeat that for 5 different dots, one in the center, up, down, left, right. And then it says, okay, calibration complete. You want to exit, or do you want to refine it? Refine means, do you want to do it again? I strongly suggest at least do one horizontal and one with the camera held vertically. And then just repeat the process. So go to refine, and hit your set button, okay. And it's going to repeat the process again with, starting in the center and, with the little dot, and then you're going to hold the multifunction button and go through the 5 different ones. And then when you're done, if it's been done successfully, it'll say calibration complete. At that point, you can just select exit and hit the set button.
So I misunderstood refine. I thought refine. When I hit refine and it wanted me to do it again, I thought, it didn't get it, and it's going to overwrite what I did. But they're additive.
Yeah, exactly. A couple of things about that. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yes.
I mentioned
This
already
is
a couple
why
of
I
little
did this
precautions.
show right here. This is why.
I really appreciate the opportunity. Um, a couple of little things. One is that if for whatever reason, when you're calibrating it, because of the physiology of your eye, we know that there are going to be some photographers for whom this system works sporadically or just doesn't work. And it's not because I think the battery in my ear pods has gone out. So can you hear me okay, Steve?
Yeah, you're still coming through audio wise. Maybe it switched to your, it might have switched to the, built-in mic.
It switched to the computer.
That's fine.
But anyway,
I'm sorry I'm keeping you so long. I apologize.
No. This is all good. You can talk to me here till midnight. I'm good. There are some people for whom, for the physiology of their eyeballs and their eyelashes and their eyelids and so on, that the eye control either just won't work at all or it works sporadically. We know that. Okay. I can't give you a percentage of how many people. It doesn't really matter. As a user, all you can do is try the calibration and see. If it doesn't work, either because, hey, it isn't lined up with the way your eyes are designed by the man upstairs, or if you just simply made a mistake, if you kind of rock the camera side to side, and it didn't get positioned right, it'll say calibration failed, and it'll ask you, do you want to repeat it or start over again? So if you get that error message, just try again a couple of times and just be mindful of, looking straight into the camera, move your eyes, but not, your head or, whatever. And don't move the camera either. You want to calibrate it in different lighting conditions, even if most of the time you tend to work in, let's just say you tend to shoot wildlife outdoors or whatever, and you're in sunlight most of the time. It's still not a bad idea to repeat the calibration procedure on the same channel, assuming that, your eyewear is the same and all that stuff, to repeat it over and over again. Don't clear it and do it again. Just repeat it. It learns more about the physiology and movements of your eye if you repeat the calibration on the same channel in different lighting situations. Obviously, in dim light, your pupils are wider. In bright light, they're not. That kind of thing. It's not like every time you use it, you have to calibrate it first. But as a new user, it's not a bad idea, assuming you get it to work, to repeat the calibration occasionally in different sorts of scenarios, because it will learn more about your eye movements from the calibration procedure. Now, keep in mind, it does not learn your eye in simply using the camera to autofocus and look here, look there, and that kind of thing. It's through the calibration procedure that it learns that.
Okay.
I think those are the main points about it. And I'm going to come back to what I said first. Assuming that it works for you. It's nuts how quick this lets you work. And another thing too, you still have the option of any of the AF areas, and you have the option for subject detection and tracking to be on or off at your choice. This is nuts. You can be photographing people. Steve, I could see somebody in your position using this for band photography. You can look at a face with a single focusing point. Okay. You can look at a face, push the button down halfway, bingo. The point is there. And then if you've got your eye detection and your tracking on, it'll immediately now put a box around the face or the eye, even though you didn't initially, you may not have even looked at their eye. You may have just looked generally at their face. If it detects an eye, bingo, you'll see the little box around the eye. And if that person now starts, if your tracking's on, and that person now starts moving across the stage or whatever, the box follows them. It is nuts. I mean, it just, I said before, it is fire. And
I am so excited to own something like this. I'm still on an original R5 and an R6, so I don't have this feature. But someday, someday. All right. So we've covered every single autofocus setting, option, sub menu. I put out to the world, do you have any questions for the man himself, for Rudy? And I got a couple of them in. I've got 4 of them. 2 of them are almost identical, but I've picked 4 to mention. And the first one is actually somebody who commented on the original show just recently, actually. People still comment on it 3 years later. This is from Patrice Hugo on YouTube. And here's the question, quote, I have a technical question regarding the Canon R5 might also apply to all Canon R. There is a lot of evidence supporting the native ISO values for the R5, example 800, 3200, 12,800 when shooting in video mode. Is this confirmed by Canon? And does this apply to still photos? Thank you for considering my question. And he also added, believe it's a he. So what they're talking about when he says there's, evidence of this, or what was the wording that he used? Yeah, a lot of evidence supporting. He said, so they're talking about the concept that a Canon R has a native ISO like 800 and 3200, which have less noise than even lower ISO values. Example, 800 would be less noise than 600. 12,800 might be less noise than 6,400. Any support from Canon on that? Have they confirmed that? Because I've seen this too.
Yeah, a couple of things. First off, you'll see a lot of like anecdotal, whether it's speculation or informed speculation, or, I read here that this is the case and all that. Just be careful if it isn't coming straight from Canon. I'm not saying from me, but, there's people, well-meaning people that'll put stuff out there that isn't straight from the proverbial horse's mouth. So that's one thing. The short answer is yes, this is true if you're in video and if you're shooting in Canon log. Canon log 3, Canon log 2 on the newest cameras, the R5 Mark II and the R1, or original Canon log if your camera goes back that far time-wise. It's only using the log or extremely flat contrast settings in video. Otherwise, if you're shooting video and you're distinctly not shooting Canon log, you're shooting with like a standard picture style, or in the new cameras with the picture controls on something else, then no. And it does not carry over in any circumstance to stills. So just because, a cinema user said that, hey, ISO 1600 is a special low noise setting, it doesn't apply regardless of the camera if you're shooting still pictures. Okay. Then the rules of engagement are pretty much what we've always known, that hey, normally the lower the ISO, the less noise you're going to get usually.
Okay. Next one is from somebody on X, formerly known as Twitter. Michael Greening is at Ring of Fire 1 on X. And Michael said he's wondering what might cause him to get inconsistent results with eye tracking. He said it's almost as though it can't decide what to focus on, so it misses over 50% of the time for him. And I went back and forth with him on this, trying to figure it out before I brought this question up. And I sent this to you in advance because this is one I think really mattered that you had some time with. But after some back and forth, he actually posted a photo. And this photo was like a boudoir shot of a female model. I won't say scantily clad, but boudoir shot, right? With Christmas decorations in the background, a tree and a snowman. Now, understand we're at a semi-shallow depth of field. The tree and the snowman were not sharp. And this model is looking straight down the barrel of the lens, and autofocus was getting the snowman's eye in the background behind the model, right? And he did say, again, through follow-up, that the snowman was only one example. In other shots, it actually focused on her bra using face and eye detection, or other things in the scene. It seems as though it was purely going for contrast and finding the greater contrast in the scene, regardless of finding an actual eye. And then I have a follow-up thought to this, depending on what you say.
If memory serves, and thank you very much for sending this to me in advance so that I had a chance to kind of look into it a little bit. If memory serves, I hope I'm correct, you said that this person had said they were shooting with an original R5 or R6, if I'm not mistaken. I hope I'm not mixing up.
I think so.
Here. Keep in mind that there have been some not just feature changes that we've discussed for the last, couple hours, but that there have been some other changes under the hood as well. the newer and I'm not trying to sell you a new camera, okay? If to the reader or to the viewer rather, I'm not trying to sell you a new camera, but the subject identification and so on. There's no question that if we move to a mid-generation camera like an R8 or an R6 Mark II, or now to the newest ones that have the most recent technology, the R5 II and the R1. There's no question that the subject identification and so on is superior. But in any of them, understand that when you're talking human face detection and eye detection, the system is set up. It doesn't know where the subject is to begin with, but it's looking for what it thinks is a human face with two eyes, a nose, and a mouth. I get it that a snowman in the background is not the same as a human model, male or female, that is probably taking up more of the scene and in the foreground. But if for whatever reason the two things that it thought were eyes were simply more distinct in terms of the contrast between the outside of the snowman and the color of the eyes, I don't know if they were little black lumps of coal or what, but or the lighting was maybe a little brighter on them than it was on the model. I don't know. But if it, for whatever reason, thought, okay, there's the eyes, that can happen. I've heard of wildlife photographers shooting birds where you have eye detection. You can use it. But where they were shooting them in a, with a bunch of surrounding trees and branches and stuff with, light and shadow and all. And sometimes just depending on the patterns of dappled light and stuff, the system can see like two dark bits of shadow and it can think, oh, must be an eye. And, it'll put focus there. And you're saying, wait a minute, that's not where my bird is. It's, my bird's over here. It can happen. So what do? One thing you could try doing. Now, I'm at a little bit of a disadvantage because I no longer have an original R5 or R6 as a sample that I can just play with. I very quickly played with an original R6 yesterday, as a matter of fact, when I made a quick trip to the office. And one thing you can try doing is instead of having your focus area set to face detect plus tracking, which in the old system meant, whole area AF, try setting one of the zone AFs, but have face detection active if it will let you. If it does, what'll happen is if you have, one of the larger zone AFs, I'm not talking a whole picture area now, but one of the zone AFs, it'll within that be able to sort of ascertain, okay, is that a face? You won't have eye detection, but you'll have face detection. And it'll usually, as I recall, put like a bunch of little points around, on the face telling you in servo, hey, this is where we're focusing. This is the primary thing, as long as it's within the AF
zone
area.
Right.
The zone. Another thing you can try with the whole face detect plus tracking active, in other words, once again, we're talking the whole area, is you can try just tapping the screen near the model. And sometimes that'll give you that'll give the system a starting point. You're sort of cheating it and saying, okay, start here and look around rather than just look everywhere. Try those two things. This I will say, and again, I'm not trying to sell this customer another camera. Okay, you can get tons more mileage out of the original R5 or R6. But if you do decide at some point to go to another camera, even a camera like an R8, which is, a less expensive full frame camera, I'm just using that as an example, you've got more flexibility in terms of being able to combine the other AF areas with face detection. And you'll find now you can narrow where the system is looking and still have face detection and that tracking capability. And what I mean is that, you can have the box near a subject and it'll, if it sees that there's an eye and a face there, it'll just, kind of move things over a little bit. And that can be helpful too. So those are the things I would suggest.
And here's the thing, because I saw the photo and I don't have the photo here to show, unfortunately, but the snowman was vertical, pure white, black eyes, two dots, clearly looked like eyes, even though it was less sharp in the background. And she was at a 45-degree angle, bending over looking up like this. So there was less body, there was less ability to identify as a human. But you answered the follow-up question, which I had, which is clearly it worked, right? It got an eye. It got the snowman's eye. It was working. And my question was going to be, how do you can obviously, if it detects an eye, you can use that multifunction joystick to move which eye it's choosing after the fact. My question was going to be, was there a way to cheat in advance to tell it, I want you to favor over here when you get focus? And you mentioned touching the screen, or I find if I use a focus point on somebody's eye first before I go into eye detection, it will usually go near that area.
Right.
So that helps. So the next two questions, these are almost identical. It was almost weird to me how they both came up with this. And I know what I would say. I almost answered both of these emails myself. I mentioned this earlier, saying we're conflating focus versus focal plane and depth of field is the way that I interpreted this. And I was going to answer the emails myself. And I thought, wait a minute, I got the expert. So let's read these. And I think they're pretty similar. So first, Mark Blair, it's Punches and Pins on Instagram. And he says, for shots taken ringside at pro wrestling or boxing, does face eye detection eliminate capturing the entire body of an athlete? I think he means there, if it gets the face, does it remove the ability to capture the whole body in focus? He continues, could their body become out of focus? If you focus using a zone, would you still get a blurred enough background to enhance the athletes, or would everything be in focus, the crowd too, and you have to create blur and bokeh in post?
Okay. As you said, it's largely what it amounts to is depth of field. And that's going to depend on the distance you are from your subject. I'm not trying to talk to somebody like they never have been around a camera before.
This guy's good. I've looked at his work. He knows what he's doing. So yeah.
Let me just, if I can editorialize for a second, it brings me back to my, days of my youth. I used to love wrestling. So it's great that we got a guy that's photographing the squared circle, as they say. Right on, brother. But to get to your question, if you use face detect autofocus and eye detect, or even if you didn't use the eye detect, you just use face detect autofocus with subjects to detect being people, okay, and it puts a box around the person's face or even a little box around the eye, it's telling you, hey, that's where it's going to try to put the sharpest plane of focus, period. Now, if you're photographing, from a distance and you're not using a super long telephoto lens, and if you've even got the liberty of, because of the available light or whatever, you can stop the lens down a little bit, you'll probably get that sharpness, not just at the eye, but going down the uniform, going down the legs. If they got one leg kind of kicking behind them or something, maybe even including that. But that's a factor of your depth of field. The focusing system, whether we manually pick a single focusing point and put it ourselves at the eye, whether the camera's using eye detection, whether we're using one of the big zones. We talked about zone AF before and how the system is going to try to focus on the nearest thing inside the zone. It's still going to give us one plane of sharpness. From there, it's up to us. If we got to have more sharpness front to back, it's up to us to, stop the lens down, zoom to a wider setting if it's a zoom lens, right? Where you'll get more apparent depth of field, and so on. There are going to be times where, no matter what our intent, the camera's not going to be able to get everything in focus. I go back again to my early days, and just really looking at and admiring so much some of the action shots in like Sports Illustrated magazine, and you'd see some of these wonderful sports photographers using or then unique 600 f4 lenses and stuff, and they could be at a football game and get a running back coming straight at the camera, and the eyes were, and this is manual focusing now, but the eyes were in focus, and the athlete's leaning forward slightly, bracing for contact. And if you look closely, you could see that their belt line was slightly soft. Okay, you could see the stitching in the uniform, right? Like the shoulders and stuff, and right, at the eyes. and it got a little bit soft as you got away from that. Sometimes you have to live for that. Something
Right.
in the picture sometimes has to be boss. And it's up to you to decide if it needs. A fashion photographer might say, hey, I need the torso and the clothing in the midsection to be the sharpest thing. This fashion designer from Paris is paying us thousands of dollars to do this. It doesn't matter really if the model's eyes are tack sharp, or conversely, you know, you might be shooting, something where, hey, the face is the important thing. If the bride's dress goes a little out of focus, I don't care, as long as the eyes are tack sharp. That's up to the photographer. But yeah, the only way you're really going to improve that is by depth of field. Just simply picking a bigger zone or a bigger area, it's still going to focus on one plane.
And again, the focal plane here to me is the key instrument, right? Understanding what a focal plane is and how much depth of field you have. If you have a model, if you have a fighter and you're shooting that fighter at 45 degrees and they're looking this way, it's entirely possible that you use eye detection we talked about left, right eye, auto, both eyes, that it would get the front eye, but because it's dark, you're shooting at 1.8 and you're shooting with a 400 millimeter lens, or let's say 2.8, 400 millimeter lens, your depth of field is minute. Whereas if you're ringside and shooting with 24, you're going to have a little more, at least perceived leeway. So Jason Rubin on Instagram, JMR_images, was the second question that is very, very similar. It was really interesting. I mostly shoot events with a lot of movement, primarily hockey, theatrical stage productions, and concerts. And I want to make sure my subjects stay crystal from head to toe. Interesting, he did a vertical there. Not nose to tail, right, or nose to ears, but head to toe. What focus area points work best for these types of situations? And again, to me, this would be more focal plane, but I'll let you go ahead with this.
It's kind of the same answer. I realize that the question isn't exactly identical, but essentially it is, or at least very, very similar. And the bottom line is you're shooting vertical pictures, presumably, composed real tight, fast moving action subjects with a telephoto lens, probably wide open. And yeah, you start getting in there with a 300-2.8 or a 400-2.8 wide open. Even if you nail focus on the face, yeah, you may have a little bit of softness elsewhere in the not elsewhere in the frame, just elsewhere on the subject. I already gave the example a second ago about those tight football shots where the eyes were just magically sharp, but you could see the waistline was a little off. It wasn't tack anymore. I guess you got to decide as a photographer, look, really, in the grand scheme of things, what's more important? Is it more important to get the uniform tack, or is it more important to get the face tack? Because sometimes if you're shooting real tight and wide open with a long lens, you may not have the opportunity to do both. It's the same answer we gave the fellow a second ago on the wrestling and the boxing. It's the same concept. Right. It's and just simply going to like the one of the big zone AFs where with a flexible zone we can expand it and so on. That's not going to make everything that it covers sharp. All it's going to do is just tell it, okay, look for the sharpest point or where we're going to put sharpness over a bigger area. Right. But it's still going to be one plane of sharpness. Think of it almost like laying a sheet of glass in front of the subject, figuratively speaking, where that's where our sharpness is. And if we want sharpness to be in front of that or behind it, at that distance with that lens, and the only option is to start picking smaller lens apertures. And I get it. For indoor sports, shooting at f8 or f11 a lot of times isn't an option. So
yeah, and it's kind of the same situation, and that is when you make a larger zone, it's still gonna pick a point to say this is where I want to choose focus. You're just giving it a larger pool of focus points to choose from. Is the way to do it. So last thing, and then we're done. And Rudy, let me just say up front, this is way longer than I expected you to stay. I owe you so much. If you are at Imaging USA this year, I'm going to find you and buy you a drink. But I mentioned in the first show we did 3 years ago that David Bergman and I had been talking, and he mentioned that he uses a dual back button focus. And he told me how he did it, and bells went off in my head, lights went off in my head. And I started setting it up. He did a video on it, but he did the video after we talked. And when we talked, the way he set it up was his primary focus. He just set the camera focus up at the time, older bodies, to face and eye detection. But then he had a second button, the asterisk button on the back of the camera. And last time somebody corrected me on how I pronounced it. My apologies. But when he hit that button, it switched him to single point, because sometimes when we're shooting live music, eye focus works great for a while, and then the light doesn't hit their face right and you can't get eye focus. So you very quickly want to be able to switch to single point or whatever it is, or in my case, expanded. And so he had the second button to expanded, and I didn't like it. And the reason is what you said earlier. When you customize a second button with autofocus settings, it's only active in that mode when you're holding the button. So if my second, let's assume that second focus point is a single point and it's centered. When I hold that button, it's centered, and I go, okay, well, now I'm in single point mode. I want to move that focus point. What do I have to do to move the focal point? I have to let that button go and hit the button. I can't. As soon as I let the button go, I'm back in face and eye detect. So I switched them. My primary default focus is a point. That way, without holding anything down, I can move my focus point around. When I hit the secondary button, it goes into a full zone, whole area, face and eye detect, and it'll track people all over the screen as it wishes, right? Yeah. So that's how I ended up doing it. And then I think, David, if you watch this, correct me if I'm wrong, I think David switched to that version as well. But I didn't want to say to everybody, go watch the first video to learn how. I'm just going to show you really quick how I do it. And this way, Rudy can tell me where I do it wrong. So again, my first autofocus setup, let me jump back to here. My first there's no card in the camera. Sorry about that. But my first autofocus setup might be a single point that I move around the camera like so. Okay. Or in my case, it might be expanded point. But here's what I do. I go to customize controls when shooting, page number 1. And I go to customize buttons for shooting. And the first thing I do is this button here, which is your normal shutter button. I go into the normal shutter button, and instead of having it do meter and autofocus, I change it to, I only want it to do meter. I don't even have my shutter button do focus for various reasons that I like. I don't like the half press for focus. So now I'm set, right? Single expanded point, move it around the screen as I wish. The shutter button will meter and trigger the shot, but I use back button AF for my autofocus. But here's then what I do. And I think this is just a brilliant way that Canon in the newer cameras has set up the amount of control that you can do here. I go to the asterisk button and I choose that. And instead of doing AE lock or FE lock, which I never ever use, that's why it's the perfect button for me, I set that button to do autofocus and metering. So it's an AF button. So I have the back AF button for my normal shooting. When I hit this button, it will also do AF. So now it's the exact same thing. Okay. Now I have 2 back button autofocuses for my single point. But here's the thing. You then look at the bottom of this screen where it says Info Detail Set. I hit that, and here's where the magic happens. First of all, you can, in this second button, customize every single AF option. So I will go in and say that I want AF start position on, and I want it to do, whichever one. I'm just going to do the point that's selected. Okay. Then I say AF operation. Let's say that in my normal mode, I was in single shot. Here, I can go in and set it to servo, which I want. And I would use servo in both. And again, I can go over here and say, I don't want it to change that at all. Leave it what my normal one is. I'm going to do that on. Then we have AF area. And in this one, I might go and set it at, whatever it is. I might do, in this case, whole area AF, which is what I would do. My normal one would be an expanded 8 point, 9 point if you want to count the middle one. And my face and eye control, I would do whole area. Then whole area tracking Servo AF, I would do on. Subject to detect, I would do people. Spot detection, I'm not doing auto sports with helmets. So notice this one is not checked for me, and it wouldn't matter anyway because I'm doing people. Eye detection, I can set that one the way I want. I have that at auto, and there's nothing else here that I would really set. And so now what I end up with is I end up with two different buttons on the back. Autofocus is a single point I can move around the screen, and when I just move my thumb a little bit to the right and hit that second button, it switches to face and eye. So I'm shooting a band where the guitarist and everybody and the drummer, I can get their eyes, but the lead singer has a baseball cap on and I can't get his eye. No problem. I can use single point, and at any time I can just hit that other button and go, does it get their eye? It does. Perfect. Now I know I'm locked on their eye. And it's a much better situation. Did I do anything you'd do differently?
No, it's just a matter of, in terms of your personal choice, which buttons do you want to have live for this? That's up to personal taste. Obviously, your choice of, what exact AF parameters you want when you push a given button. Some photographers might, lean towards, one more than another. That's, again, personal taste, and so on. There's nothing wrong with the way you did it. You see a lot of folks, and it's not just folks that are doing theatrical performances and, music performances like you are. They could be doing sports. They could be doing wildlife. You hear a lot of people talking about dual button back autofocus activation. And the cool thing is that, many of our competitors offer similar types of functionality. The way you go about it may be a little different, but the idea is that it's almost like having two separate cameras in terms of the way your autofocus works, just by pressing one button versus pressing another. And again, I think back to, my younger days when when we thought just an autofocus system was like, miraculous. I mean, if I had seen this kind of stuff back in those days, I repeat, I'd have thought I'd died and gone to heaven.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really, we're living in a magical time. Rudy, you've taken so much time. I mean, what are we at now? Over 3 hours. It's going to be a long episode. Again, I want to stress to everybody, I've got timestamp I can't even talk today. It's just been one of those days. Timestamp chapter markers in the description on YouTube, and for the podcast people, it's in the blog post, which means it should show up depending on your podcast app. In your podcast app, in the description, you'll see the times that you can fast forward to so that you can get to the specific topic that you want, the subject that you want. You want to jump and listen to the listener questions, whatever it is, you can do that. Rudy, dude, I can't say thank you enough. I so appreciate you doing this. I so appreciate Canon USA letting you do this and lending me the R1 for this. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And I'm glad that you had a good New Year.
It's coming right back at you. The privilege is mine. Seriously, Steve, it's wonderful to be, back with Canon, if I can speak frankly, and to be able to, speak on these kind of things. You're not asking me to work. This is, they say, love what you do and you never work a day in your life. And this kind of thing is a perfect example. I could sit here and talk to you for the next 12 hours about this stuff, because it's something I like. So it's a marvelous opportunity. I thank you for the opportunity. I thank you also for what you're bringing to the photographic community. I'm not talking about Canon. I'm talking about to the photographic community in general. When you start digging in behind the shot in so many of your episodes and so on, it's not just, gear and buttons and that kind of stuff. It's a wonderful addition to what we as photographers now have access to online. So, my profound thanks to you for the opportunity and for everything you do for all of us. So wonderful to see you again, even if it is, electronically this time, and certainly hope we cross paths again in real life very soon. Certainly wishing you and your family a great 2025 and beyond.
Thank you so much. It's good to see you again, even if it's over Zoom. But hopefully Canon will send you, if you want to go to imaging or to WPPI this year, so that I can see you and give you a hug in person again. I really, really appreciate it. And I do want to remind everybody that this show, first and foremost, is a podcast. It's available in podcast apps, whatever podcast app you choose. It's available on Spotify. It's available on Amazon Music, Google Music, all of those things in an audio-only format. Or if your podcast app or outlet of choice, like Spotify does not, but if your podcast or outlet of choice for podcast supports video, there is a podcast feed of the video. And of course, the video is also put up on YouTube. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit like, please hit subscribe, drop a comment down in the bottom what you thought, share it with your friends, do all of that type stuff. If you want to find the blog post for this show, where I wrote a little bit about the show, I wrote a little bit about Rudy, head on over to the website. It's behindtheshot.tv, not .com. It's behindtheshot.tv. Now, if you want to follow me anywhere, you can do that as well. I am pretty much at Steve Brazel everywhere you go. I've stopped using a few places, but I do still have accounts there, so you can follow me anywhere, and I get the notices for that. So to everybody, thank you so much for watching this long. If you made it this long, as always, thanks a ton to my guest, the technical marketing consultant for Canon USA, Mr. Rudy Winston, the legend himself. Be sure to join us next time as we try and get inside the mind of a great photographer by taking a closer look behind the shot.